There are places in the jungle where maps don't show and where people never return. We slept next to one of them. I've captained ferries across the San Francisco Bay for more than 20 years, and I can tell you with certainty that the bay has moods. It's not just a body of water, it feels alive, temperamental, like a creature whose temperament you have to learn if you want to survive it. Some mornings it's like glass stretching out so calm you could almost walk across it. Other days, the wind claws at the boat and the currents tear beneath the surface like muscle trying to break free. But the fog is different. The fog isn't weather, it's an intruder. I don't mean that lightly. Anyone who's been out there long enough knows what I mean. It comes rolling in off the Pacific like a wall, so dense and heavy, it eats light. It swallows sound too, bending it, warping it, so that what you hear isn't necessarily where it came from. More than once I've cut engines mid-channel, straining to hear the horn of another vessel that sounded close enough to scrape my hull, only to realize it was miles away. You learn to respect it. You learn not to trust yourself inside it. I thought I had mastered that. I thought I had built my life around it, tuned my senses, sharpened my instincts. Until the night I realized the fog was not just weather. It was a voice. It was a late shift in November, a chartered run. The ferry was mostly empty, just a handful of passengers who had booked the ride across to Sausalito. We were running later than usual because the group lingered in the city after sunset, and I was eager to get them across before the tide turned ugly. The bay at night is beautiful, but it demands respect. Currents change, winds shear off the bridges, and the fog thickens in ways you don't see coming. That night, it was already waiting for us, low and pale, hugging the water like smoke rising from an unseen fire. The passengers were quiet, a mix of tourists and a couple of locals, nothing unusual. They stood near the rails at first, watching the skyline glow behind us, but as the cold settled in, most retreated inside the cabin. I did my rounds, checked my gauges, then settled back at the wheelhouse. Everything was ordinary. Until it wasn't. I first noticed the silence. Not the kind you expect late at night, but a thicker silence. The bay usually hums with sound. Engines, gulls, waves against the hull, the constant low groan of the city in the distance. But as we pushed deeper into the fog, those layers fell away one by one until the only thing left was the drone of my own engines. Even that felt muffled, like the fog was swallowing it whole. And then I heard them. Voices. Low, indistinct, drifting up from the deck below. It sounded like passengers talking. A man and a woman, their tones soft, conversational. I remember glancing at the clock, thinking it was late for small talk, but it didn't strike me as odd at first. People talk. Sound carries differently in fog. I adjusted course by a degree and kept my eyes on the radar. But then it grew stranger. The voices didn't move. Normally you can hear footsteps, the shuffle of jackets, the creak of the deck when people shift around. Not this time. The voices just hung there like they were suspended in the mist itself. I leaned out of the wheelhouse, trying to place them, but all I got was a wash of pale gray. I stepped down, leaving the instruments on autopilot. The voices grew clearer as I descended. They were right there, right on the other side of the cabin door. But when I opened it, the deck was empty. No passengers. I walked the length of the ferry, checking each side. Nothing but fog pressing against the railings, thicker than I'd ever seen. I ducked into the cabin. Empty benches, vacant seats. The passengers who had been inside, they were gone. My first thought was panic. Maybe they'd gone topside without me noticing. Maybe they were playing some kind of trick. But the air was still, oppressive. My own breathing sounded too loud. I circled back, calling out. My voice felt like it didn't travel, like it was caught in the fog and folded back toward me. And then, from behind me, clear as if someone stood inches from my ear, I heard a man say, "Don't leave the light." I spun, heart hammering. Nothing. No one. Just the dull glow of the deck lamps bleeding into the fog. I wanted to call it exhaustion. I wanted to tell myself I'd been working too many shifts, that I was overtired, that fog plays tricks. But when I returned to the wheelhouse, something else was wrong. The radar was blank. No returns. Not the Golden Gate, not Alcatraz, not even the channel markers. Just a black screen, pulsing, searching, as if the bay itself had been erased. That was when I realized I could no longer see the water. The fog was so dense it had swallowed even the surface below me. I felt the ferry moving, felt the vibration of the engines, but beneath the railing there was no trace of the bay, just a shifting white void. And the voices came again, louder this time. Not one, not two, but many. A chorus, rising and falling, words slipping in and out like half-remembered dreams. Laughter, then whispers, then sobbing. I gripped the console so tightly my hands cramped, every instinct screaming at me to steer, to sound the horn, to cut engines, but I couldn't even trust my senses. I told myself I'd drop anchor. Wait it out. Fog clears eventually, but when I went to the bow, chain rattling in my hands, I froze. There was no splash when the anchor hit. It fell, chain unspooling, but there was no sound of metal hitting water. No resistance. Just endless clattering, disappearing into silence. That was when I knew in my bones, I was no longer on the bay. I can't tell you how long I stood there, clutching the rail, staring into that void. My watch had stopped ticking. My phone had no signal. The boat hummed beneath me, steady as ever, but the world outside was gone. And then the passengers came back. One moment the ferry was empty. The next, they were standing at the railings, at the benches, inside the cabin. Every seat filled. Silent, still. Their faces were pale, features blurred, as if the fog had seeped into them too. They weren't moving, not breathing, not blinking, just staring into the whiteness. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. None of them turned. None acknowledged me. And then they all spoke at once. Not to me, through me. A single phrase layered in 100 different voices, all threading into the same words. You shouldn't be here. The sound rattled the glass of the wheelhouse. My vision blurred, nausea flooding me. I staggered back, clutching the console for balance. When I blinked, they were gone again. The deck was empty. The benches bare, only the fog remained. I wanted to believe, I imagined it. Hallucination, carbon monoxide leak, anything. But the anchor chain was still gone, spooled out into nothing. The radar still empty, my watch still frozen. And then I heard it again. The first voice, the man's, calm and insistent. Don't leave the light. Only this time I realized he wasn't warning me. He was pleading. I should have turned the engines off then. Should have waited, anchored, prayed for the fog to burn away with the dawn. But I couldn't. The silence pressed too hard against my ribs. The voices kept bleeding in at the edges of my thoughts, soft as tides against stone. And the longer I stood still, the stronger they became. I had the terrible sense that if I lingered in one place, they would gather more fully until they were close enough to touch. So I set the throttle forward. The ferry pushed ahead, cutting through the gray soup. The compass still spun true, but every landmark was gone. The city's glow, the bridges, the red blink of buoys, wiped away as though the bay had been peeled from the earth. I followed instinct, leaning into every second of training, but nothing outside me confirmed we were moving at all. Only the low, thrumming vibration under my boots told me I wasn't standing still. Minutes, maybe hours, bled together. My throat was raw from calling into the fog. Sometimes I thought I saw figures standing on the water just beyond the rails, motionless silhouettes, too far to see clearly, too wrong in shape to call human. One looked bent double, head too long. Another perched at an angle, as though standing sideways on a wall I couldn't see. Each time I blinked, they melted back into the white. But the worst came when the voices sharpened. They stopped drifting and began to mimic. I'd hear my own voice, calling back at me from below deck, repeating words I just said. Once, clear as day, I heard my father's voice, a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, calling my name from the stern. I ran, half choked with hope, only to find nothing but mist curling over the railing. That was when I began to understand. The fog didn't just swallow sound, it learned it. I gripped the wheel, knuckles bloodless, willing myself to stay awake, but exhaustion pressed down, heavy and sweet. And for one heartbeat, just one. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the ferry was no longer alone. Shapes loomed ahead, rows of vehicles, pale and glistening under lamps that hadn't been lit in decades. RVs, camp trailers, the kind you see parked in forgotten state lots. Their roofs dripped condensation, their windows fogged from the inside. They stood in the water, half submerged, yet bone still, as if the bay had become a parking lot. I cut the throttle, heart hammering, but the ferry drifted closer anyway. The fog parted just enough to let me glimpse the cracked logos, the peeling decals. One had California plates from the 70s. Another bore the faded paint of a rental company that had gone bankrupt years ago. And still, light burned inside them. Yellow warmth seeping through curtains. The flicker of television screens behind glass. Shadows moving in the windows. Families, it looked like. Kids darting from couch to bunk, a woman bent over a stove. None of it possible, none of it real. Yet the ferry rolled straight past them. No sound of water against metal. No wake. Only the low hum of the engine and the creak of my breath. That was when the smell hit. Not salt, not diesel. Something chemical, sharp, like burnt plastic mixed with ammonia. It coated my tongue, stung my eyes. I gagged, one hand on the rail. It felt invasive, as though the fog had opened me up from the inside. And the voices returned, clear now, synchronized. From the RVs, from the decks, from the fog itself. Don't leave the light. I stumbled back into the wheelhouse, slamming the door. Every lamp on the ferry burned at once, brighter than I'd ever seen. Fluorescence overhead, cabin lights, deck floods, even the weak emergency lanterns along the floor. I hadn't touched a switch. The ferry slowed to a crawl. The compass spun, twitching like a wounded animal. Then something struck the hull. A single sharp blow from below, enough to rock the deck under my boots. Another followed. Then another. Something was circling us in the fog, ramming the steel with a sound like bone against iron. I grabbed the radio, thumbed the mic. "Vessel in distress," I said, voice shaking. "This is Ferry 21 off San Francisco Bay, requesting immediate assistance." Nothing, just static that pulsed like breathing. I tried again, louder. "This is Ferry 21, requesting immediate." And then the static answered. My voice came back to me, word for word, syllable for syllable, but not in real time. It repeated what I'd said 10 seconds earlier. My own distress call, looping back through the fog. Something in me broke then. I knew the bay was gone, knew no one could hear me. And I understood that whatever circled us, whatever learned our voices, had been here far longer than I had. I don't know what made me do it, maybe instinct, maybe some memory of the voice that had warned me. But I ran to the supply locker and tore out the flare gun. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped it. I jammed a cartridge in, yanked back the hammer, and fired straight into the sky. For a split second, red light ripped through the fog. A violent wound in the gray. And for that heartbeat, I saw them. Figures, hundreds of them, ringing the ferry. Standing knee-deep in the water, their bodies blurred, their heads tilted at broken angles, their mouths all moved in unison, though no sound came out. The light caught on their eyes, dozens of pale orbs staring upward. Then the flare guttered out, swallowed whole. Darkness crushed back, the ferry groaned, metal straining. I thought the hull would tear open, but then silence. No ramming. No voices. Just the heavy thrum of the engine again, steady and real beneath me. And slowly, impossibly, the fog began to thin. It didn't retreat like weather. It peeled back inch by inch as though dragged away by invisible hands. Shapes reemerged, the faint outline of Angel Island, the pinprick red of the Golden Gate, the glimmer of city lights on the horizon. I staggered to the bow, staring as the bay returned piece by piece. My watch ticked again, my phone lit up with a faint bar of signal. The radar blinked back to life. But the anchor chain was gone. And the passengers never came back. When we finally pulled into Sausalito, the ferry was empty. The manifest said 13 had boarded in San Francisco. None disembarked. The company filed it as a clerical error, said I'd miscounted, said the fog had rattled me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the wheelhouse and the fog begins to curl over the bow, I still hear that man's voice. Don't leave the light. Only now, it sounds like mine. They didn't believe me. The Coast Guard interviewed me for hours that night, their voices flat, skeptical, eyes darting toward each other whenever I spoke. 13 passengers gone without a trace, and all I had was a story about fog and voices. They checked the manifest twice, called the booking office, even questioned the dock staff. The paperwork was sloppy, they said. Maybe a double entry. Maybe the charter company padded numbers for insurance. But I knew. I remembered their faces, their jackets, the way they huddled against the cold before retreating inside. I knew who I carried aboard. And I knew who never left. They ran sonar sweeps across the channel, divers at the piers. Nothing, no wreckage, no bodies, no luggage. The anchor chain was never found. It was as if the bay had swallowed everything whole and sealed itself again. The official record closed with a line I can't read without shaking. No passengers confirmed. I tried to sleep that week, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard them. Not loud, not menacing, just there. A murmur in the silence of my apartment, a shuffle at the edge of the hall. Sometimes, right before waking, a breath close to my ear. Don't leave the light. I stopped telling people. The other captains laughed when they heard rumors. Fog makes fools of all of us, they said. One man told me about a time he sailed right past Alcatraz without seeing it. Another swore he heard a foghorn bellowing out of clear sky. They all had stories, but not like mine, never like mine. Weeks passed. I kept working, because what else could I do? Bills don't care about ghosts. Every trip across the bay felt like playing chicken with something I didn't understand. And though the fog came back again and again, it never thickened the way it had that night. Not fully, not yet. But I noticed things. The radar would glitch at random, say pulsing with phantom echoes. Deck lights flickered though the bulbs were new. And once, as we passed beneath the bay bridge, I saw something perched on a piling, bent double, head tilted, watching. The next morning, there was nothing. I started digging. Old Coast Guard logs, maritime reports, newspaper clippings. I told myself it was for closure, to prove I wasn't insane. But the deeper I went, the colder I felt. Because it wasn't the first time. Scattered over 100 years, I found mentions, buried in side columns, dismissed as accidents. A commuter boat in the 50s, vanished passengers, captain alone and raving. A tourist charter in 78, listed as sunk, though no wreck was ever located. A Coast Guard cutter in 92 reporting extreme fog interference, crew shaken, equipment dead. Each time the official record smoothed over the gaps. Clerical error, mechanical fault. No passengers confirmed. And then there were the whispers. Old-timers at the docks, men with salt in their hair and eyes that slid away when I asked. They said that the bay had places it didn't give back, that the fog wasn't just weather, it was memory. One retired ferryman told me something I can't shake. He leaned close over his beer, voice low. You ever notice, he said, how the fog's thickest where the camps used to be? Before the bridges, before the highways. Folks used to park their rigs right at the shore. Whole families, living out of RVs, trailers, disappeared overnight, some of them, left the stoves burning. Bay just took them. I wanted to laugh, but my throat locked. RVs, he said. Families. Exactly what I'd seen standing in the water that night. I stopped asking questions after that. Too many eyes lingered on me, waiting for me to slip. I kept my mouth shut at work, played the role of steady hand at the wheel, but I couldn't stop listening. Every horn blast in fog sounded like a cry. Every silence felt loaded. And one night, 3 months later, it happened again. It was late, another charter. Only this time I didn't have passengers, just cargo. A truckload of equipment bound for Angel Island. Easy run. But as we cleared the harbor, the fog rose, sudden, heavy, thicker than it had any right to be. My stomach turned cold. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. Lights on full, radar blinking. For a while it held steady. Just fog, just weather. Then the radio crackled. Not static, not Coast Guard chatter. My voice. Vessel in distress, it said. This is Ferry 21 off San Francisco Bay, requesting immediate assistance. My chest locked. It was the same words I'd spoken that night. The same tone. my own terror thrown back at me. I didn't answer. Couldn't. The radio clicked again, a chorus this time, men, women, children, 100 voices bleeding together. Don't leave the light. My hands shook so badly the wheel slipped under my palms. For a second I thought I'd black out, but then through the fog I saw it, red glow ahead, faint and pulsing. I thought it was a buoy, a safe marker. I steered toward it, desperate for something solid. But as I drew close, the glow lifted, rose higher, and I saw it wasn't a buoy, hanging in the fog. The exact same flare I'd fired months ago. My knees gave, my vision tunneled, and when the light guttered out, I saw them again, figures in the water, circling, mouths moving in silence. Dozens, hundreds, pale eyes locked on me. I don't remember steering back. Don't remember how the fog lifted. All I know is I woke tied to the dock, engines cold, cargo untouched. My logbook read empty. The clock had lost 6 hours. I filed no report, and I will never sail again after dark. But here's the thing. I still hear them. In the fog that creeps through the city streets, in the hum of the refrigerator at night, in the silence before dawn. Always the same warning, worn thinner each time. Don't leave the light. And I'm starting to think it isn't meant to save me. It's meant to keep me inside. Because whatever waits in the fog, whatever wears our voices, whatever gathers in silence, it doesn't want me to leave. It wants me to join. It's been almost 7 years since that night, and I've never left the bay. I told myself I'd walk away, find another job, another coast, another life. But leaving is harder than it sounds. My father used to say some places get inside you, soak into your bones, and you never really shake them. The bay is one of those places. I no longer work ferries. After the second incident, I resigned before they could fire me. Officially, I retired for health reasons. Unofficially, they were glad to be rid of me. No captain wants a man at the helm who stares too long at fog banks and flinches at his own radio. Now I rent a one-bedroom apartment in Oakland, a short walk from the water. Most nights I can hear the distant horns as ships crawl in from the Pacific. The sound should comfort me. Instead, it makes my skin crawl. Every low note feels like it's calling my name. I've tried to move inland, I swear I have. But each time I look at listings, something in me refuses. My hands won't sign the papers. It's as if the fog itself has a hold, whispering in the back of my mind, "You belong here." So I stay. I drink too much. I sleep too little. I walk the piers at dawn, watching the city wake. And everywhere I go, I keep seeing signs. Shadows flickering in water, lights where no lights should be, echoes of voices that die before I can place them. The worst are the dreams. They're not dreams, not really. More like fragments. I see the deck lamps bleeding into white, the blurred faces of passengers who never boarded again, the anchor chain rattling into nothing. I hear the flare gun crack, and the flare never burns out. It just hangs in the fog, forever suspended, casting red light over pale eyes in the water. But last month, the dream changed. In it, I wasn't on the ferry anymore. I was standing on shore, somewhere I didn't recognize. An RV park, by the looks of it. Rows of old campers and trailers, abandoned, overgrown with weeds. Their doors hung open, curtains rotted, stoves rusted solid. But faint light glowed inside them, the same yellow warmth I'd seen on the bay that night. And in the glow, shadows shifted. Families sitting at tables, children climbing into bunks, a woman humming in a kitchen. Then they all turned their heads at once toward me. Their mouths opened, and in one voice, layered and endless, they whispered, "Don't leave the light." I woke drenched in sweat, my body shaking. My apartment smelled faintly of burnt plastic and ammonia. I didn't sleep again. The next morning I went looking. It felt insane, chasing a dream. But something in me knew. There are places around the bay where old campgrounds once stood, before the freeways, before the bridges. I drove along the shoreline, miles of forgotten lots and half-buried foundations. Most were fenced off, paved over, erased. But north of Richmond, tucked behind a derelict marina, I found one. A dirt road led down to a wide lot, cracked and overgrown, weeds splitting the asphalt. At the far end, a line of rusted hookups poked from the ground, And there, scattered like bones, were the shells of RVs, faded fiberglass, windows busted, tires rotted flat. I walked among them, heart hammering. The silence was too thick, like the fog had pooled even without rolling in. I peered inside one trailer. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs thickened the corners. Empty, but the smell was there. That same acrid chemical tang, burnt plastic, ammonia. I staggered back, choking. The air shimmered in front of me, heatless, like the space itself was bending. And in that shimmer, for one impossible moment, I saw them, the passengers, 13 of them, huddled together inside the empty RVs. Faces pale, eyes unfocused, mouths moving in silence. When I blinked, they were gone. Only dust remained. I ran. I don't remember driving home. For days after, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, a waking nightmare fueled by guilt and fear. But deep down, I knew. The bay hadn't taken those people into the water. It had given them back, to the fog, to the abandoned places it still claimed. And whatever lives in that fog, it isn't finished. 2 weeks later, the news broke. A ferry out of Tiburon failed to return. Weather had been clear, seas calm. The Coast Guard searched for days, found nothing. 32 passengers, gone. The official statement? Mechanical failure. I nearly laughed when I read it, the same line they'd fed me. The same lie they've been telling for decades. That night, unable to sleep, I walked to the waterfront. The fog had rolled in heavy, blanketing the bay in silence. I stood at the edge, staring into the white. For a long time, nothing. Then, faint but clear, I heard it. My own voice. Vessel in distress, it said. This is Ferry 21 off San Francisco Bay, requesting immediate assistance. The words I'd spoken years ago, playing again, and layered beneath it, dozens of others, children, women, men, all folding into the same phrase, endless and low, don't leave the light. The water rippled, shapes shifted in the fog just beyond reach. I turned and walked away, heart hammering. But as I reached the street, I realized something. The voice wasn't coming from the bay anymore. It was coming from behind me, from the fog curling between the houses, from the city itself. And now, even in daylight, I hear it. In the rush of traffic, in the hum of power lines, in the static between stations, always the same warning, worn thinner each time. Don't leave the light. I don't think I have much longer, because the fog isn't just out there on the water anymore. It's moving inland, and soon there won't be anywhere left to run. I never believed in unseen things until the silence of the wilderness forced me to. It's strange how the very stillness you drive into for peace, the remoteness you chase when you escape into the American backcountry, can become the same silence that swallows you whole, leaving you certain you're not alone. My name's David. I'm 47 years old, and for the better part of the last decade, I've lived out of an RV, moving from one stretch of wilderness to the next. Some folks chase tourist sites, cities, beaches. Me, I've always been drawn to the edges of maps, the empty pull-offs, the dirt roads where the ranger station shutters before dark. I was raised in Montana, grew up on wide open land, and I thought solitude was a familiar friend. But the wilderness, it has ways of reminding you solitude isn't what you think. There are eyes out there, unseen, watching. It started one fall in the mountains of northern New Mexico. I had parked my rig on BLM land far off the main Forest Service road in a clearing circled by pinyon pines and juniper. The kind of spot where you step out of your RV at night and see a billion stars like you've broken into heaven's vault. The air was crisp, almost sweet, with the smell of sap and dry earth. I'd been driving for 12 hours, chasing that quiet that only comes when you can't hear a single engine for miles. And when I killed mine, the silence rushed in like a tide. It was the kind of silence that makes you breathe softer, as if you're intruding on something older, something that owns the land in ways you never will. That first night I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, at least not then, but because of the noise, or rather the almost noise. I lay there in the bunk, staring at the ceiling of my RV, and realized my ears weren't resting. They were straining. You know that sense when you know something should be there, wind through the branches, a distant coyote, but the silence is so complete it feels wrong. It was like the world had muted itself, and the longer I listened, the more I swore I heard something beneath it. Not footsteps, not animals, just the sense of being listened to. I told myself I was tired, that road weariness makes tricks of shadows and echoes. I even laughed out loud in the darkness, the sound too sharp, bouncing back off the trees like it had no right to exist there. But sleep never came easy, and when it did, it was shallow, restless. I dreamed of standing in my own campsite, looking up at my RV and seeing a silhouette in the window, tall, thin, unmoving, watching me. The second day I hiked. I told myself I needed exercise, but really I just needed to feel like a human body in a world that had begun to feel too still. The trails out there aren't marked, not really, but you can follow the dry washes and the broken deer paths. Hours passed with the sun climbing high, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots and the occasional wheeze of a raven overhead. But I couldn't shake it. That presence. Every few minutes I'd stop, turn, scan the tree line, and every time I was certain something had just moved out of sight. By the time I made it back to camp, dusk had already stained the horizon a dirty orange. My RV looked smaller than it ever had, like a toy left in the dirt. I told myself I was just letting imagination twist the ordinary, but when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, a chill swept through me. The air smelled off, like wet stone after rain, like earth overturned. I searched every cabinet, every corner. Nothing had changed. Nothing was missing. And yet, when I pulled the curtain shut, I swore it moved against my hand like someone else had brushed it a heartbeat before me. That night, I kept the lantern burning. I've never been one for leaving lights on. It wastes propane, it kills the stars. But darkness felt like an invitation. I tried to read, but my eyes kept sliding to the small window over the sink. Beyond it was nothing but shadow. Thick, unmoving shadow. And then knock. Not loud, not sharp, just a faint, deliberate tap against the side of the RV. My breath caught. I sat frozen, book in hand, staring at the wall where the sound had come from. Minutes passed. My pulse thudded in my ears. And then, again, tap, tap, lower this time, closer to the ground, as if someone were testing the metal skin. I should have opened the door. I should have thrown the light outside and proved to myself it was an animal. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I wasn't there. And that, right there, that was when fear took root. Because in all my years of camping, I had never once felt the urge to hide inside my own RV. When dawn came, I stepped outside with shaking legs. Nothing. No tracks. No disturbance. Just a stillness that pressed against my skin, heavy and expectant. And for the first time, I questioned whether I should move on. But something held me there. Call it stubbornness, call it curiosity. Or maybe it was the feeling, stronger than ever, that leaving would mean turning my back on whatever was watching. And I couldn't bring myself to do that. Not yet. The third night is when I understood the silence wasn't emptiness at all. It was listening. It began the same, stars spilling across the sky, a cold breeze drifting through the pines. I left the lantern off, determined to face whatever came. Hours passed in darkness, the creak of the RV cooling, my own breathing too loud, and then from somewhere beyond the tree line came a whistle. Soft, rising, falling, like a tune hummed without lips. My body went cold. I've spent years in the wilderness. I know the calls of owls, the cry of elk. This was neither. It wasn't animal. It wasn't quite human. It was something in between, drawn out, patient, as if whoever or whatever was making it had all the time in the world. I gripped the edge of the mattress, nails digging into the fabric, and held my breath. The whistle repeated, closer. Then silence again. A silence so deep it felt like it was waiting for me to answer. And God help me, I almost did. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, straining every muscle not to move. I was terrified that even the shift of fabric beneath me would count as a response, that the whistle was not just a sound but a call, an invitation, or worse, a test. My chest ached from holding my breath, but when I finally exhaled, it felt like the night itself inhaled, swallowing my breath whole. The whistle did not return, but the quiet was worse. That's the thing about silence in the wilderness. It's never absolute. There's always a leaf, a distant creak, some far-off animal, but this was silence thick enough to feel like weight on my skin, pressing down, flattening me against the mattress. That silence whispered that I was not just alone out here, that something else had claimed the air, and I was intruding. When the first gray streaks of dawn broke across the horizon, I stepped outside, exhausted, every muscle twitching. The pines stood in still columns. The clearing looked untouched. But I noticed something then that turned my stomach. The gravel beneath my RV tires looked different. Not disturbed like tracks, but patterned, as though something had pressed into the stones without weight, like shapes of feet that didn't leave depth, just arrangement. They formed a loose circle around the vehicle, an outline as if someone or something had walked laps around me all night long. I forced myself to crouch down, touching the stones. They weren't warm. They weren't cold. They just felt wrong. Too smooth where the impressions had been. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Animals pacing? But no. No claws, no pads, no randomness. This was deliberate. Geometric. Human, but not. That day, I drove into town, 30 miles of dirt and then highway, telling myself I needed supplies. In truth, I just needed people. Noise. Proof the world was still normal. I stocked up on canned food I didn't need, gas I already had, and lingered too long in a diner where the waitress's chatter was a balm. When she asked if I was staying in the area, I lied, told her I was headed north. I didn't want anyone to know where my camp was. Not because I feared they'd follow, but because some instinct deep in my bones told me whatever circled my RV wasn't something you shared casually. Still, as the sun dropped lower and the highway carried me back toward the forest road, I felt the pull. That irrational tether dragging me back to the clearing. I could have left, could have camped at a KOA, parked in a lit-up lot where the glow of televisions and campfires pushed shadows back. But I didn't, because part of me needed to understand, needed to see just how deep this unease ran. That night, I did something reckless. I left the RV door unlocked. It wasn't bravery, it was desperation. I had to know if what circled me was real. I lay in the bunk, every nerve alert, the latch loose, the threshold open. Hours crawled by. The stars wheeled overhead. My eyelids drooped with exhaustion, and that's when I heard it. The faint creak of the step. Someone was on the metal stair. I froze, pulse hammering, mouth dry. The handle didn't turn. The door didn't swing. Just one slow shift of weight on the step, and then nothing. No retreat, no advance. As if whoever or whatever stood there was content to remind me it could cross the threshold anytime it wanted. I don't know when I lost consciousness, but I remember waking in a blur of half-light, the faint smell of damp soil filling the cabin. Morning. The door was shut, latched. My hands trembled as I checked it, as though expecting it to swing wide on its own. The steps outside, dry, clean, no mud, no prints, nothing. But the smell remained, that wet earth scent, like a grave after rain. By the fourth night, fear had rooted so deep it colored everything. I jumped at the sound of my own boots crunching gravel, that flinched at the creak of pine boughs overhead. But worst of all was the doubt. That sickening sense that maybe I was unraveling, that maybe these weren't encounters at all, but fractures in my own mind. And yet every time I considered leaving, packing up and driving until the unease fell away, I would catch some faint sound or lack of sound that told me leaving wasn't freedom. It would only mean being followed. That night, I kept the lantern burning again, shadows jittering across the cabinets. I sat at the small table, staring at the condensation on the glass of water I'd poured. My hand hovered near it, but I couldn't bring myself to drink. And then, softly, like a breeze with no air, I heard my name. David. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a shout, not even a whisper. It was more like a thought someone else had placed inside my head, audible but without sound. My name, drawn out low from just outside the RV. I gripped the table, heart slamming. No, I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. No, no, no. Denial was safer than belief, because if I believed what I heard, it meant something unseen knew me, knew I was here, knew me enough to speak the one word that could strip me bare. For long minutes, nothing moved. Then a new sound began, slow and deliberate. 3 taps against the back wall of the RV. Same rhythm as before. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. This time I couldn't stay put. I rose, legs trembling, and grabbed the flashlight. My hand shook so violently the beam wavered, cutting across cabinets, walls. I forced myself to the door, every step louder in my ears than thunder. I yanked it open and thrust the beam out into the clearing. Nothing. The pines swayed gently. Gravel gleamed pale under the light. But the smell of soil hit me hard again, stronger, sharper, like freshly dug earth. I swung the beam toward the back of the RV, breath-catching. And there, against the metal, were 3 dark smears, finger marks, mud or something darker. Each print impossibly long, stretched, as though the hand that left them had too many joints. I slammed the door shut, locking it, sliding down until my back hit the floor. Panic rose like fire in my chest. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't imagination. Something had touched my RV, something that knew my name. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat there on the floor, flashlight in hand, the lantern hissing, shadows dancing like they had lives of their own. I thought about leaving. I thought about starting the engine right then, tires spitting gravel, fleeing toward the nearest sign of humanity. But every time I pictured it, I saw headlights dying in the rear view, saw the empty roads stretching on forever, and knew in the marrow of my bones that whatever circled me here could follow me anywhere. When dawn finally broke, I staggered outside. My legs shook as I wound the RV. The prints were still there, dark, dried, streaked where they had dragged downward. The smell clung to the metal, heavy and damp. I reached out, almost against my will, and pressed my fingers against the stain. The moment I touched it, I felt cold shoot up my arm into my chest. I jerked back, breath gasping, eyes watering. The stain lingered on my fingertips, not mud, but something finer, like ash. I wiped it on my jeans and backed away. I knew then that staying had crossed into something irreversible. The wilderness was no longer indifferent. It was aware. By the 5th night, I couldn't convince myself of safety anymore. I tried to hold on to rational explanations, weather stains, animals, exhaustion, but they slipped through my fingers like water. Each time I wiped away the prints, by morning they returned, darker, more deliberate. My own RV began to feel like it wasn't mine anymore, like I was only borrowing it from something that had claimed it long before I arrived. That evening, clouds moved in from the west, heavy and low. I thought maybe the storm would break the spell of the silence, shake the forest into something I could recognize. But the rain came slow, a drizzle that tapped the roof with arrhythmic whispers, and even that sound carried unease. Every drop felt purposeful, measured, like fingers testing for a weakness in the shell of my home. I sat at the table again, lantern hissing, the storm giving the night an edge of movement. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. My reflection in the RV's darkened window looked gaunt, hollow-cheeked, more stranger than familiar. And that's when I heard it. Not from outside, not from the clearing, but from inside the RV. A breath. It came from the back, near the bunk. Long, shallow, human in rhythm, but too steady, too even. I froze, hand halfway to the lantern. My mind flailed for explanations. Had I left the vent open? Was air whistling through some crack? But no, this wasn't wind. It was breath. I gripped the flashlight, heart slamming so hard I thought my ribs would break. I forced myself to stand, to step toward the narrow hallway. The shadows deepened with each step, and the breath grew clearer. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. I shined the beam toward the bunk. Empty. My blanket rumpled from nights of tossing, my pillow sunken, nothing else. But the air shifted, cold against my face. The smell of soil flooded stronger than ever, heavy enough to gag me. My knees weakened, my body screaming to run, yet I couldn't. And then, David. This time, it was out loud. Not booming, not whispered, just spoken, in a flat, almost conversational tone. The sound didn't come from behind me or outside. It came from the small space itself. as if someone stood right there in the narrow hallway, shoulder to shoulder with me, unseen but present. I staggered back, nearly dropping the light. "Get out," I heard myself rasp. My own voice cracked, weak. "This is mine. You don't belong here." Silence. For a heartbeat, I thought it had gone, that the stillness meant retreat. Then the RV groaned. The entire vehicle shuddered on its springs, as though something immense had pressed a hand against the side. The windows rattled. The cupboards creaked. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, shaking so hard the beam cut erratic lines through the air. I scrambled to the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. They slipped once, twice, my palms slick with sweat. Finally, the engine roared to life, loud and alive in the silence. Relief broke through me, but only for a second. Because through the hum of the engine, I heard something else. A low murmur, like dozens of voices whispering all at once, too fast to make out words, too layered to belong to one throat. I threw the RV into gear. Gravel spat beneath the tires as I tore out of the clearing, headlights bouncing off the trees. Branches clawed at the windows, the forest pressing tight against the narrow road. I didn't care if I tore the undercarriage to shreds, I just needed out. Out and away. The forest road stretched on longer than it should have. I knew it well by then, the turns and bends, the split where the main road met the ridge. But tonight, the headlights cut across the same stand of pines again and again, as if I was driving in circles. My stomach lurched with nausea. I slammed the wheel hard left, tires fishtailing, but the road only carried me deeper into identical darkness. The whispers grew louder, not behind me, not outside, inside. Filling the cabin, pressing against my ears, tumbling over each other in a chaos of sound. I shouted, wordless, ragged, just to drown them out. The engine whined, my foot crushed the pedal, and still the road twisted back into itself. When the first figure appeared, I nearly drove off the path. It stood on the shoulder, tall, thin, unmoving. My high beams cut straight through it, not around, not over, through. A shape darker than shadow stretched into a human outline, but wrong in proportion. It didn't move as I passed, didn't flinch at the light, just stood, head cocked slightly, watching me. I screamed then, pure panic, torn from the gut. My hands shook the wheel as I gunned the RV faster, the engine threatening to tear free. I told myself not to look again, not to check the mirrors. But I did. I couldn't help it. There were more. Shapes along the roadside, motionless, every dozen yards closer each time. As if the forest itself had lined them up to greet me, each one taller than the last, each one tilting its head the same way, like they shared a single thought. The whispers crescendoed. My own name bled through the chaos again, layered, overlapping, hundreds of voices calling David, 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 until the name didn't feel like mine anymore, until it was just a sound they had hollowed out. I don't remember how I got out of that road. I only remember the moment I burst onto asphalt, the sudden jolt of real pavement under my tires, the road widening, splitting, leading to the faint glow of a highway sign. The shapes vanished. The voices cut. The silence returned. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose behind me. My eyes were bloodshot, hands locked stiff around the wheel, every muscle screaming. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, surrounded by the hum of engines and the chatter of strangers, I sobbed. Not because I was safe, because I knew safe wasn't real anymore. The wilderness had let me leave, but I wasn't sure it had let me go. For days, I stayed close to towns, parking in crowded lots, the noise of people like armor. But every night, as sleep dragged me down, I would jolt awake certain that someone had breathed my name against my ear. I checked doors, I checked windows, always locked, always untouched. But the smell of soil lingered faint in the air, as if it had seeped into my clothes, my skin. That's the thing about unseen beings. Once you know they're there, once you felt their gaze in the dark, you can never go back to not knowing. I told myself I wouldn't go back. Not to New Mexico, not to that clearing, not to any remote campsite that left me cut off from the world. I told myself the wilderness was done with me, that I could live in the safety of noise and neon. But the truth is, I was already marked. I learned fast that escape isn't about roads. Escape is about what follows you and what waits for you no matter where you park. A week later, I set up camp at a state park outside Flagstaff. Not wilderness, not remote. The kind of campground where families line up RVs like dominoes, where kids ride bikes in loops, where you can smell somebody else's dinner through your open window. I thought being surrounded by people would cure the fear. Thought maybe all I needed was laughter nearby, human voices cracking the night. The first night passed in peace. I even slept. For the first time in days, I closed my eyes and let the hum of nearby generators lull me into rest. But in the middle of that sleep, I dreamed again. The same dream I'd had in New Mexico, standing outside my RV, looking at the window and seeing a silhouette inside. Tall, thin, still. Only this time I wasn't alone in the dream. I could see the other RVs in the park, lined up with their lights glowing soft, and in every single window, silhouettes stood, watching. I woke drenched in sweat, heart rattling. Outside, the campground was quiet, just the distant sound of a dog barking. I told myself it was just a dream, a mind infected by stress. But when I looked at the condensation on my window, my stomach knotted. A single line had been drawn through it, not random, not smeared. A vertical stroke, sharp, precise, like a mark left by a fingertip. The second night, the voices came back. Not the chaotic whispers of New Mexico, but low, rhythmic murmurs just outside the thin aluminum walls. I pressed my ear to the glass and felt the vibrations hum into my skull. But when I opened the window, nothing. Just still air, the faint glow of other campers' lanterns. I wanted to knock on a neighbor's door to ask if they heard it too. But some sick part of me knew the answer already. Even if they did, they wouldn't admit it. Some fears are private burdens. By the third night, I cracked. I couldn't stay in a campground, not with families around. If those things could follow me here, then they weren't bound to remoteness. They weren't tethered to wilderness. They were tethered to me. And if they could step from my RV into another, I couldn't take the risk. So I left, middle of the night, tires crunching gravel while everyone else slept. I drove without plan, only knowing I had to put distance between myself and them. Hours bled into hours, headlights slicing through empty roads. The desert opened around me, black sky, darker earth. My eyelids burned, fatigue clawing me, and then far ahead I saw lights. At first I thought it was a rest stop, maybe another campground. But as I drew closer, I realized the glow wasn't electric. It flickered, warm, uneven. Campfires. A cluster of them, dotting the desert floor like fallen stars. I slowed, unease prickling the back of my neck. There was no road leading to them, no vehicles parked nearby, just firelight in the open desert, flames steady as if they burned for no one but themselves. I should have kept driving. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going. But I stopped, put the RV in park, watched the fires burn. The silence out there was total. Not even the wind moved. And in that silence, I swear I heard movement, not footsteps, not whispers, just the faint crackle of fire carrying a rhythm that wasn't natural, like the flames themselves were murmuring. My chest tightened. I slammed the gear shift, forced the RV back onto the road, and drove hard, never looking back. But the image stayed lodged in me, fire burning without people, flames speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. By the time dawn came, I was a wreck. My hands shook on the wheel, eyes bloodshot, body hollow from sleeplessness. I pulled into a gas station, parked beneath fluorescent lights, and sat there gripping the steering wheel as though letting go meant drifting into something else entirely. The attendant gave me a look when I stumbled inside, like he saw more than exhaustion in me, like he saw something trailing close behind. That night, I refused to camp. I parked behind a strip mall, concrete under my tires, dumpsters nearby, traffic a constant hum. I thought nothing could reach me there. Concrete was protection, but when I woke at 3 a.m., my RV was cold, not just chilled, but wet. Moisture clung to the walls, to the sheets, to my skin. The smell of soil filled the cabin, rich and heavy, and for a moment I thought I was back in the New Mexico clearing. I bolted upright, eyes darting. My reflection in the dark window wasn't alone. For just a second, Only a second. Another shape stood beside me in the glass. Tall. Thin. Tilting its head the same way the roadside figures had tilted theirs. And then it was gone, like it had stepped backward out of the reflection. I ran outside, bare feet slapping the pavement, chest heaving. Nothing. Just the hum of streetlights. But when I looked back at the RV, I saw the marks again. Smears against the siding, too high to reach without a ladder, too long for human hands. That's when panic turned to despair, because I understood it wasn't about the forest. It wasn't about the campsite. It was about being seen. Once seen, you can't unbe seen. Once named, you can't unbe known. And no matter where I went, wilderness, town, pavement, desert, they followed. Always just out of sight, always close enough to leave a trace. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until dawn again, exhaustion blurring the road, fear rooting in every glance at the mirror. My reflection didn't look right anymore. Too pale, too hollow. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw another set of eyes looking back from it. Not mine. Never mine. And then, on the edge of Utah, I nearly crashed. I'd been awake too long, body trembling with adrenaline and fatigue when the road dipped into a canyon. The sky was overcast, the world muted, and in the middle of the road stood one of them. Clear this time. No shadow, no blur. A figure the height of the RV, body thin as a sapling, arms that hung too long, fingers dragging the air. Its face, or where a face should have been, was nothing but a smooth plain, featureless, reflecting the gray sky. I screamed, slammed the brakes, tires shrieking. The RV swerved hard, wheels skidding gravel, the world spinning in a blur of dust and rock. By some miracle, I didn't tip. The RV stopped inches from the canyon wall, my chest heaving, hands welded to the wheel. When I looked back at the road, empty, gone. I couldn't breathe. My throat burned from choking sobs. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, every part of me breaking under the weight of it. I understood then that panic couldn't save me. Running couldn't save me. Nothing could. Not roads, not people, not light. Because the unseen weren't out there anymore. They were in here. With me. I didn't drive for a long time after that near crash. I sat in the RV, forehead pressed against the wheel, lungs aching like I'd run miles, not driven hours. The road lay empty in front of me, quiet, still, as though nothing had ever stood there. My rational mind screamed to get moving again, get to town, get to people, get to anywhere, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed by the thought that moving meant playing into their rhythm, because that's what it had become, a rhythm. Appear, vanish, whisper, touch, vanish again. It was a game I was losing, and they knew it. When I finally forced myself back onto the road, I kept my eyes forward, refusing to check the mirrors. I couldn't bear to see them lined up along the shoulder again. Hours blurred together, daylight bleeding out until night wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I pulled off on a dirt spur, too tired to think, too hollow to care, and let the RV idle to silence. Inside, the air was damp again. That smell, wet earth, overturned soil, something older than rot, clung heavy in the air. I lit the lantern, its hiss filling the silence. My reflection in the window was pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed. For the first time, I thought, maybe this is what they want, to strip me down until nothing human remains. I tried to sleep, but sleep isn't mercy when you're being hunted. My dreams weren't mine anymore. They were theirs. I saw the clearing in New Mexico, the circle around my RV, the figures standing still in the tree line, but the dream never ended at dawn. It kept going, darker, longer, until the figures stepped closer, and I realized they weren't standing at the edge of the trees at all. They were already inside the circle, already inches from the RV walls, already reaching out. I woke with a shout, sweat plastering my shirt, the lantern sputtering low, and then I realized the sound hadn't come from me alone. It had echoed. Someone had shouted back. I froze, heart hammering, my ears strained. Silence. Then, another sound, the faint scrape of metal against metal. My stomach dropped. The door handle? I crept toward the front, flashlight trembling in my hand, every step like walking deeper into my own grave. The handle twitched again, once, twice. Then slowly, too slowly, it began to turn. No, I whispered, though the word was swallowed by fear. I slammed my hand on the lock, bracing my weight against the door. The handle jerked harder this time, rattling, shaking the frame. My whole body shuddered with it. I pushed, teeth clenched, sweat dripping. The RV groaned, metal bending under pressure from outside, as though something enormous pressed its palm flat against the entire wall. And then, silence. I stayed there, locked against the door, every muscle quaking. Minutes dragged, maybe hours. Finally, when I pulled back, the handle lay still. My hands trembled as I shined the flashlight across it. The metal was streaked with something dark. Ash again. Long streaks trailing down like melted fingerprints. I backed away, knees threatening to collapse. I couldn't keep this up. My body was broken, my mind cracked, and still they hadn't shown me their true face. That was the worst part. The knowing. They weren't trying to kill me. Not yet. They were peeling me apart layer by layer until I'd have no strength left to resist when they finally stepped through. That night, I sat at the table, lantern sputtering, and stared at the door. "What do you want?" I said aloud. My voice cracked, but the words came out steady enough. The silence that answered felt alive, thick, waiting. "You've followed me. You've touched me. You know my name. What do you want?" For a long moment, nothing. Then from the dark corner near the bunk came a voice. Flat, hollow, familiar in a way that chilled my marrow. "We want you to see." I dropped the flashlight. It clattered, beam jerking across the cabinets, across the floor. My pulse thrashed in my ears. The words hadn't echoed. They hadn't vibrated in my head like before. They had been spoken inside the RV. I scrambled back, tripping over the table leg, eyes wide, searching shadows. Nothing moved. No shape stood in the corner. Just the smell, thick and choking now, the air itself tasting like soil pressed on my tongue. See what? My voice was raw, desperate. Silence. Then, tap, tap, against the window this time. I whipped the beam toward it, hands trembling so violently the light danced. And that's when I saw it. For the first time, clear and undeniable. A face, or the suggestion of one, pressed against the glass from outside. Smooth, featureless skin stretched too tight, ridges where eyes should have been, a hollow where a mouth belonged. It leaned closer as if trying to mimic what humans do when they want to be recognized. And though it had no lips, no voice, the sound still came. "David," I screamed. I don't even remember doing it, but my throat tore raw with it. I ripped the curtains shut, staggered back, slammed into the wall. My breath came in panicked bursts. My body shook so violently I thought I might split apart. The lantern flickered, hissed, and died. Darkness consumed the RV, and in that dark, the whispers rose. Hundreds of them, not outside anymore, not beyond the walls, inside, filling every inch of space, pressing against my ears, spilling into my mind. "See, see, see." I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head, rocking like a child, begging them to stop. My own name blended with their chant until I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. My thoughts weren't mine anymore. They were theirs, a current dragging me deeper, and then, in a single instant, silence again. The lantern flared back to life on its own, weak and trembling. The RV was empty, the windows bare, no prints, no face, no whispers. Just me on the floor, broken. But the soil smell remained, heavy, permanent. That was the moment I understood the truth. There would be no final confrontation, no last stand. They weren't trying to kill me. They weren't even trying to drive me away. They wanted me to carry them, to be a vessel, to take them wherever the road led next. I left the RV that night. It wasn't courage. It wasn't a plan. It was desperation, raw and wild, a need to breathe air that wasn't thick with soil and whispers. I grabbed nothing. No bag, no food, no keys. Just stumbled out barefoot into the dirt, lungs pulling in the cold night like water after drowning. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that had haunted me since New Mexico, but now it felt different. Not empty, not listening. Waiting. Like the entire night had stopped mid-breath to see what I would do next. I ran. Not toward the road, not toward lights. Just ran, weaving between trees, gravel slicing my feet, branches clawing my arms. My chest burned, my body begged to collapse, but still I pushed on. And with every step, I felt them following. Not behind me, not to the side, but everywhere. In the sway of branches, in the crunch of soil, in the darkness itself, the unseen weren't chasing. They were moving with me, in me, through me. I don't know how long I ran before the forest broke open. One moment I was stumbling through pines, the next I was standing in a wide clearing under the raw face of the moon. My lungs heaved, my legs shook. I turned in a slow circle, the clearing empty, the grass wet with dew. And then I saw it, the fires, the same ones I'd glimpsed out in the desert. Dots of flame scattered around the edge of the clearing, burning with no wood, no smoke. They glowed steady, forming a ring around me, hemming me in. I dropped to my knees, gasping. The whispers returned, rising from the fires themselves, my name, over and over, stripped of meaning. David, David, David. The flames tilted toward me as though they leaned on unseen bodies. I screamed for them to stop. I screamed until my throat tore raw. But the fires only brightened, the voices overlapping until it's like the whole world was calling me, hollowing me, pulling me apart. And then the flames winked out. The clearing went black. The soil smell hit so hard I gagged, and in that darkness, I felt them. Not seen, not heard. Felt. Hands, if they were hands, brushed my skin. Fingers trailed my arms, too many joints bending against me. Something leaned close to my ear, and in the flat, hollow voice that had claimed me since New Mexico, it spoke. Now you see. I broke. I don't remember falling. I don't remember the ground rushing up. I only remember waking hours later, sprawled in the dirt at the edge of the road. My RV sat where I'd left it, door ajar, lantern still burning, weak. The fires were gone, the clearing empty, the night still. But I wasn't the same. When I climbed back into the RV, the air no longer smelled of soil. The walls bore no prints. The windows no longer showed faces. For a brief, deluded moment, I thought maybe I had survived it. Maybe they'd finished with me. But then I looked at the mirror. My reflection stared back hollow-eyed, pale, trembling. And behind me, just for a breath, a flicker, stood another shape. Tall, thin, head tilted. And then it was gone, leaving only me, except I knew it wasn't only me anymore. I drove that morning straight to the highway, straight to the noise of cities and the safety of crowds. I told myself I'd never park in silence again. I'd never sleep in the wilderness. I'd never let the quiet claim me. And for a while it worked. I blended into the flow of people, the hum of engines, the endless motion of roads. But silence is patient. Now, no matter where I stop, whether it's a busy truck stop or a crowded RV park, there are moments, always, when sound dies, when the laughter fades, like the engines stall, the wind halts. And in that breath of stillness, I feel them again. Not outside, not watching. Inside, breathing with me, carrying me. I've come to understand this. The unseen beings in remote campsites aren't bound to the wilderness. They're bound to anyone who steps too far into silence, who lingers in solitude long enough to be noticed. The remoteness doesn't call them. The remoteness just strips you down so you can hear them when they arrive. That was the lesson I learned too late. I used to camp for peace, for freedom, for the raw reminder that life could still feel wide open, untouched. Now I know the truth. Peace is never empty. Freedom is never free, and silence is never just silence. The wilderness doesn't leave you alone. It lets you believe you are, until you're not. So when you drive your RV out past the glow of towns, past the ranger's last outpost, past the places where maps thin into dirt and shadow, remember this. If the night feels too still, if your ears ache for sound that never comes, if you wake to the smell of soil when no rain has fallen, leave. Don't wait. Don't question. Leave. Because once they know your name, once they press their hands against your walls, once they lean close enough to breathe into your dreams, there's no leaving. Not really. I know that now. I live it. Every mile, every stop, every silence. And when I'm gone, when my RV sits empty at the edge of some forgotten clearing and you find it, locked, still abandoned, don't linger. Don't open the door. Don't look into the windows. Because if you do, you'll see. I should never have gone alone. That thought has lived with me every day since, circling back in moments when the wind carries a certain smell of brine, or when the walls of my own house creak as if something inside is shifting against them. I tell myself I was only doing my job, only answering a client's call. But there are things you can't unsee, can't unfeel, things that stain every bit of your perception afterward. That house by the shore in Cape Cod, it wasn't just a place. It was something alive, and it wanted to be remembered. I was an architect, though I carried myself more like a surveyor at that stage of my life. I'd worked mostly with restorations, old New England homes, sometimes even the more eccentric projects, lighthouses converted into summer rentals, Victorian shells reborn with glass and steel. That October, I was called to evaluate a property outside of Chatham, perched at the edge of the Cape, where the land crumbles into dunes and salt grass. The owner, a lawyer from Boston, was trying to decide if the house could be salvaged, turned into a high-value rental, or whether it was too far gone. It was called the Salt House. Locals whispered the name, and when I asked the client why, he just laughed and said it was because the walls sweated brine. I assumed it was just one of those stories old beach towns like to invent. But when I pulled my car off the narrow road and saw it for the first time, the hair on my arms rose in an involuntary salute. The house stood like a crooked tooth against the gray Atlantic, its white paint stripped to bare timber in places, shingles curled, windows filmed with salt fog. A weather vane spun slow circles though the air was still. The dune grass pressed against it like a crowd of whispering figures. The driveway was rutted sand, and no car had pulled in for years by the look of it. My boots sank as I crossed to the porch, and every step felt less like an approach than an intrusion. Inside, the air was damp and sharp with salt, the tang of rusted iron and something faintly organic, like hair left in a drain. The foyer ceiling sagged, plaster freckled with dark blooms of mildew, and the wallpaper hung in curling sheets. At first, I thought the pattern was some faded floral print. Then I stepped closer. It wasn't print at all. The wallpaper had texture. Fibers knotted into one another, thin and brittle like strands of hair. I tugged at a corner where it was peeling back. The material came away with a papery rip, and what I held was unmistakable. Hair, pressed flat against parchment-like backing, stiff with salt. My stomach lurched. I let it fall from my hand. There's a moment when you're trained to be rational, when your brain tries to file even the strangest discoveries into order. Old homes were often insulated with bizarre materials, horsehair, seaweed, even newspaper. I told myself it must be something like that, exposed by time and weather. But then why pattern it? Why cover the entire wall with it? I pressed my palm against the surface, and the wallpaper was faintly warm, almost as if it carried a pulse. I should have left then. But I had work to do. The Salt House was 3 stories tall, narrow, with a widow's walk at the top and windows that stared out at the endless Atlantic. The wind had gnawed at the structure for decades, and I noted the expected repairs. Beams replaced, floors reinforced, roof stripped and rebuilt. Yet as I walked room to room, clipboard in hand, I began to notice that the decay wasn't uniform. Some areas were rotten through, while others seemed almost preserved, sealed tight against time. In the dining room, the long windows were fogged from the inside as though the glass itself was sweating. I wiped one with my sleeve, but the moisture beat it again instantly. The table sat in the center, swollen wood, chairs tipped on their sides, and beneath the salt haze, faint etchings carved into the glass became visible. Lines, marks, almost like tally marks, but uneven, as though scratched by someone without seeing what they were doing. I found more in the kitchen, gouges along the counter's edge, deep, irregular. At first they looked like knife marks, but they were too far apart, too long, as though something had dragged claws or metal teeth across the wood. The sink was filled with blackened salt crust. The smell was stronger there, a metallic tang that made my eyes water. I wanted to breathe fresher air, so I opened the back door. The hinges screamed. The yard was a slope of dune grass down to a narrow beach. The tide was out, mud flats stretching like a gray tongue beneath the horizon. And there, half buried in sand and seaweed, I saw the rusted husk of a camper trailer. It was small, aluminum-skinned, a relic from the 1960s. Its windows were gone, door hanging open. An RV, or what was left of one. Why it was there, abandoned in the yard of this house, I couldn't guess. The dune had almost swallowed it, but the frame remained, like a fossilized insect. I walked toward it, crunching over shells, and peeked inside. Nothing but rust and sea rot. But carved into the aluminum wall with something jagged were words, "It's not the sea, it's the house." The wind shifted. I swear I heard something then, a low vibration in the ground, like a truck passing, except there was no road nearby. My bones seemed to hum. I stepped back from the camper, suddenly aware of how silent the beach was. No gulls, no surf. Just the house behind me, looming, waiting. Back inside, I climbed the stairs, careful of the warped boards. The second floor was lined with bedrooms, each more oppressive than the last. Wallpaper of hair and salt, beds sagging with mold, closets with their doors warped shut. I opened one and nearly recoiled. The walls inside the closet were covered with scratches, deep gouges, some so fresh the wood splinters curled outward. The smell in there was suffocating, sharp as iodine. At the end of the hall was a locked door. Its frame was stronger, reinforced with iron brackets, as though someone had tried very hard to keep it shut. I pushed, but it held firm. Behind it, faintly, I thought I heard a rustling. Not movement exactly, but the sound of something shifting like sand pouring slowly. I forced myself to continue up to the attic and the widow's walk. From there, the ocean was a sheet of steel, the horizon blurred into cloud. My breath fogged the glass of the trapdoor as I peered out, and for a moment I could swear there were figures in the dunes. Just standing, watching. When I blinked, they were gone. My report was supposed to be objective, a list of structural notes, but by then I was writing strange things. Walls anomalous, organic material present, possible safety hazard beyond conventional standards. My handwriting trembled across the page. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the house pressing in. The air was heavy, carrying that tang of brine and iron. My ears popped, as though pressure was building. I tried to leave, but the front door was harder to open than before. The wood swelled against the frame, resisting me. When I finally stepped outside, the sun was already lowering, and the tide had crept closer, licking at the dune. I told myself I'd seen enough. I'd write the report from memory, send the client my recommendation, demolition. But as I reached my car, something made me pause. I could see through the warped windows of the salt house, just faintly, into the foyer where I'd first entered, and someone was standing there. A pale figure, tall, hairless, its head tilted, watching me. When I blinked, it was gone. I drove back to Chatham with my chest tight, the smell of salt lodged in my nostrils. But the house wasn't finished with me. I didn't sleep that night. Even in the comfort of the rented room above the inn in Chatham, I could feel the taste of that house in my lungs. It clung to me, a briny residue in my throat, as if I'd swallowed seawater. I showered twice, scrubbed my skin until it burned, but the smell was still there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the doorway. Long, pale, silent. I kept trying to rationalize it. Exhaustion. Low light. My eyes playing tricks through warped glass. But my hands still trembled when I tried to write the report. I sat at the little desk by the window, listening to the inn creak around me, and forced myself to put words on paper. I listed the structural faults, the water damage, the obvious dangers. But when it came to the walls, the hair, the salt, the warmth beneath my palm, I hesitated. If I wrote it plainly, no one would believe me. They'd think I was drunk or unstable. I scratched the words out again and again until the page was torn. Finally, I just wrote, "Walls contain organic material. Unsafe for habitation. Recommend demolition." I sealed it, shoved it aside, and tried to convince myself I was finished. But then, just before dawn, I woke to a sound. It wasn't the usual creak of old timber or the distant rush of waves. It was inside my room, a faint, steady dripping. I sat up. My heart was already racing. The air smelled sharp, salt and rust. I turned on the lamp. The room was empty, but the sound continued. Drip, drip, drip. It came from the wall by the head of the bed. I leaned closer. A dark stain was spreading across the plaster, slow, deliberate. I touched it with my finger, and when I pulled away, my skin was damp with brine. I packed my things in less than a minute. By sunrise, I was back in my car, driving with no destination in mind except away. Away from Chatham, away from the salt house, away from that creeping sense something had followed me. The salt smell didn't fade. It hung in the car like a passenger. I should have left it there. I should have handed in my report and let the wrecking crew deal with it. But curiosity is its own kind of rot, and mine had already set in. 2 days later, I found myself driving back down the peninsula. I told myself it was to take photographs, to strengthen the case for demolition. But the truth is, I wanted proof. Proof that what I'd seen wasn't just a trick of exhaustion. The house stood as I'd left it, crouched against the dunes, its windows blind with salt. The tide was low again, mudflats stretching out like skin peeled back from the land. I parked, left the engine running for a moment, listening. The air was still. The world too quiet. Inside, it was worse than before. The wallpaper seemed to pulse when I looked at it too long. The gouges in the kitchen counters looked deeper, fresher, edges sharp as if carved in the night. And the locked door upstairs, it was open. The iron brackets were bent outward as if something had forced its way through. I stood at the threshold for a long time, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room beyond was narrow, low-ceilinged, lined with shelves. Jars filled them, rows upon rows. At first I thought they were preserves, pickled vegetables, something like that. But when I lifted one, the contents shifted. Clumps of hair, pressed flat and floating in cloudy brine. Another jar held what looked like parchment, translucent and curling. Skin, salt-stained. My breath went shallow. I set the jar back carefully, but the shelf rattled. Somewhere deeper in the house, a sound answered. A slow, dragging movement, like something heavy pulling itself across the floorboards. I killed my flashlight. My pulse hammered in my ears. The smell was stronger than ever now, so sharp it stung my eyes. I backed out of the room, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Down the hall, toward the stairs. The sound followed. It was deliberate, unhurried, a weight shifting through the house. I wanted to run, but the stairwell yawned below me, and I knew the boards would scream under my weight. So I crouched low, pressed myself against the wall, and waited. From the shadows at the end of the hall, something moved. At first, I thought it was just the shape of the wallpaper shifting. But then it detached from the wall, unfurling, pale and hairless, long arms dragging along the floor, its head tilted unnaturally far, as if listening. I didn't breathe. The figure crept past the open door of the jar room, slow, deliberate, each limb bending with an insect's precision. When it paused, the boards beneath it didn't creak. The silence was worse than any sound. I don't know how long I stayed frozen. When I finally dared to move, I slipped down the stairs in silence, every muscle locked tight. The foyer stank of salt and rust. My eyes flicked to the front door, and I froze. The figure was there, waiting. I don't remember opening the back door, only the crash of it against the wall as I bolted into the yard. I sprinted toward the camper trailer, sand dragging at my boots. My lungs burned, my throat raw with brine. Behind me, I heard no pursuit, no sound at all. That silence was worse than footsteps. I stumbled into the half-buried RV, chest heaving. The smell in there was suffocating, but it was a different kind of rot. Rust, seaweed, age. I crouched low, trying to still my breath. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I realized I wasn't the first to hide there. The walls were scratched with words layered over each other in desperate hands. Don't let it touch the walls. It waits for the tide. The house breathes. And at the far end, carved deeper than the rest, if you hear the dripping, it's already inside you. My stomach turned. The taste of salt was thick on my tongue. I wanted to gag, and then a faint sound outside, not footsteps, a slow rhythmic vibration, like the ground itself humming. The RV groaned around me. The walls flexed as if something pressed against them from outside. My chest locked tight. I thought I was going to suffocate, and then as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence returned. When I finally staggered out, the dunes were empty. The house loomed in the distance, every window dark, every line of it watching me. The tide was coming in fast, erasing the flats, licking closer to the foundations. I didn't go back inside. I didn't need to. I drove until the salt smell faded from the air, until I could finally breathe again. But it didn't leave me. It never has. It's been years since Cape Cod. I rebuilt my practice in Boston, buried myself in blueprints and clean lines of steel and glass, anything that didn't have the weight of age in its bones. But the salt house never left me. Not really. Some nights I still wake to that sound, the faint dripping in the walls. I tear open plaster, convinced I'll find a leak, but there's nothing. Dry as dust, yet my hands come away damp with brine, the same sting in my skin I felt in that house. I told myself for a long time it was stress, trauma. Architects deal with stress fractures, after all, both in structures and in themselves. But then I began to notice other things. It started at job sites. I'd be walking the framework of a new build, bare beams rising against the sky, when the smell would hit me. Salt, sharp and metallic, stinging the back of my throat. I'd ask the crew if anyone else smelled it. They'd shake their heads. Then came the stains. In one loft I designed, the new white plaster bloomed overnight with dark patches. I tore them back myself. Behind them, not horsehair, not insulation, nothing but smooth wood. And yet the stain clung to my fingertips like seawater. I couldn't escape the feeling that the salt house had left its mark on me, that something had crossed over when I touched those walls of hair and salt. I tried to track it down again, just to prove to myself it was real. 6 months after my first visit, I drove back to Chatham, convincing myself I'd make the demolition recommendation in person. But when I reached the end of that sand-choked road, the house wasn't there. Where the salt house had stood was nothing but dune grass and shifting sand. The camper trailer was gone too, as if the tide had finally swallowed it whole. I scoured the shoreline for any sign, foundation stones, nails, even scraps of shingle. Nothing. Just the flat expanse of mud flats, stretching into the gray horizon. I asked at the town office, the library, anywhere records might exist, but no one knew what I was talking about. They shrugged. Some smiled politely, as if humoring a stranger. Others frowned, cautious, like I'd brushed against something they didn't want named. When I pressed harder, one of the older men at the counter leaned in and whispered, "Best not to go looking for houses that don't want to be found." I left shaken, but still trying to rationalize. Memory is tricky. Trauma distorts. Maybe I'd misremembered the road. Maybe it was torn down quietly, hauled away in pieces. That would explain the emptiness. That would explain everything. But then the letters began arriving. Unmarked envelopes, no return address. The first contained only a strip of wallpaper, hair pressed flat, brittle with salt. The second, a single jar lid, rusted, the rim crusted white. The third letter held a scrap of paper, warped and water-stained. On it, scrawled in a hand I didn't recognize, "It waits for the tide." I tried to burn them. I thought fire would be final. But the smell of brine filled the room as the flames curled the paper, and the hair crackled in a way that made my stomach lurch. That night, I woke to find the carpet damp beneath my bed. Salt water, no leak, no broken pipe, just a spreading stain, dark and wet, and the faint sound of dripping inside the walls. I moved apartments within the week. It followed me. I don't know how to explain it. I can't tell colleagues or clients without sounding insane. But every time the air is heavy with storm, every time the ocean wind cuts inland, I feel it near. Sometimes I hear the walls breathing, expanding, contracting, waiting. I've stopped accepting projects near the coast. I turn down restorations of old homes, no matter how lucrative. I stay inland, surround myself with new materials, sterile spaces, but still the salt finds me. It clings to my clothes, coats my tongue when I speak, and once, just once, I woke to find a figure in the corner of my bedroom. Tall, pale, tilted head, watching. By the time I turned on the light, it was gone. But the smell remained. Salt, rust, hair. You asked why I don't tell this story publicly, why I bury it here in half-truths and whispers. It's because I don't want anyone else drawn to it. The salt house doesn't want demolition. It doesn't want to be forgotten. It wants to spread, seep into memory, into walls, into people. And it has patience. I've learned that much. Every time I hear the dripping, I wonder if it's inside me already. If my own bones will someday become part of its walls. I don't know how much longer I can outrun it. But if you ever find yourself on Cape Cod, near the edge of Chatham, where the dunes press close to the sea, and if the air smells too sharp, if the world is too quiet, if you see a house standing where no house should be, don't go inside. Don't even look too long. Because once you do, it will remember you, and the tide always comes back. The water was black glass when I pulled my Volkswagen off the shoulder and parked at a gravel turnout on the southern edge of Lake Superior. I could hear the water before I saw it, the slap of waves breaking on cold stones carried through the trees like a whisper that didn't want to be caught. The lake is too big to be called a lake. It feels like an ocean. It feels like an ocean. When the wind rises, it throws the kind of surf you don't expect inland, and when it quiets, it holds its breath in a silence so heavy, you feel you've stumbled into something sacred, something that doesn't need you here. I'd been warned that camping along the Superior Shore comes with its own weight of stories, that every mile of this coast holds a grave marker for someone who never came back. I thought those were warnings for fishermen, for hikers who wander too far, not for someone like me, just pulling off for a night in my van, content to boil water on a little camp stove and listen to the waves. But the night proved otherwise. I remember sitting in my folding chair, the air so sharp with cold that every breath made my teeth ache. The smell of pine pressed heavy behind me, but in front, the lake rolled endlessly black. The stars scattered, silver shivering over water, and just when I began to feel the calm set in, the hush that makes you believe you could fall asleep in a place like this, I heard it. A horn. Long, low, and aching, stretching across the lake like some enormous throat had opened beneath the water and called out. My first thought was ferry. A night run? That made no sense. There are ferries on Superior, yes, but not here, not at this stretch. I leaned forward, scanning the distance, and that's when I saw the glow. It rose through the mist like a lantern carried by someone who'd forgotten they were supposed to keep it hidden. The outline was impossible to miss. Tall stacks, wide deck, the unmistakable silhouette of a ferry, its lights too steady, too symmetrical, floating maybe a mile offshore. My breath hitched, and my chest tightened in the kind of way your body knows something before your brain does, because that ferry didn't belong there. I knew the routes, the schedules. There wasn't supposed to be anything, not at this time, not in this season. Still, I stayed frozen, watching. The horn sounded again, and the water seemed to answer, slapping harder, pulling back, a strange rhythm that almost made sense. The glow spread wider, brighter, illuminating a path that looked like it stretched straight to the gravel where I sat. And then, clear as a voice carried over a canyon wall, I thought I heard my name. Not loud, not shouted, just the way someone might murmur it in a room when they think you've dozed off. My skin crawled so violently I nearly dropped my mug. I told myself it was wind. The lake plays tricks. Everyone says that. And yet, I couldn't shake the certainty that the ferry was calling for me. The fear didn't hit all at once. It came like the slow creep of cold water seeping up your boots. I packed my chair away quick, tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, imagining things. But as I slid into my van, the horn sounded again, and this time it was closer. I swore I felt the vibration under my tires, like the gravel trembled with it. Inside the van, I locked the doors, though what good would that do against sound, against light? My curtains didn't close out the glow. It slipped around them, thin slices cutting across the interior until it looked like the walls themselves were trembling. And then came the smell. It was faint at first, like wet iron, like the tang of blood on a coin you've held too long. Then stronger, like old engine grease, like metal left to rust in salt air. I pressed my sleeve to my nose and sat rigid, listening. The whisper came again. My name. Clearer this time, from outside. Every instinct told me not to open the door, not to look. But fear twists you, doesn't it? Makes you lean into the very thing you want to run from. My hand moved before my mind could catch it, unlocking the side door and sliding it open just a crack. The glow struck me first. Blinding, pale, cutting through mist like a searchlight. It should have revealed water. It should have been distant. But it wasn't. It was right there. A bow, massive, steel ribs etched against the night. The ferry was docked against the gravel like the lake had never been there, like it had rolled silently to shore, and figures stood on its deck, still as posts, their faces turned toward me. The horn bellowed again, and every bone in my body locked tight with dread, because I realized it wasn't just sound, it was summoning, and my name was carried in the echo. I stumbled back, slammed the door, and fumbled for the ignition. My hands shook so badly the keys slipped twice before they found the slot. The van roared to life, headlights flooding the trees, but when I looked back at the water, nothing. No glow. No ferry. Just the black waves rolling in, indifferent, like nothing had broken the night at all. I sat gripping the wheel, heart hammering, unable to move. I should have driven then. I should have fled. But the stillness pressed so hard it pinned me in place, and I told myself I must have imagined it. Exhaustion. Shadows. The mind turning water and light into more than they were. Until I saw the wet footprints. They trailed from the shoreline straight toward my van. Long, uneven steps pressed deep into the gravel. Water still pooled in them, though nothing else around me was damp. They stopped at my door, and then one more horn. But this time, it came from behind me. I froze when that horn tore through the night behind me, so close that the metal shell of the van shivered. The sound didn't carry from the water anymore. It pressed against the rear doors like something vast had crouched down right behind me and exhaled through a hollow throat. My breath hitched. My first thought was that the ferry had somehow pulled itself onto land, that it loomed just yards away with its bow against the trees. But when I turned the mirror, all I caught was the faintest shimmer of pale light in the mist, rippling through the pines. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, whispering aloud like a child saying a prayer. It's nothing. It's nothing. It's the lake. Just the lake. My voice sounded pathetic, tinny in the van's cabin, and the moment the words left my lips, I regretted them. Like speaking them out loud gave permission for the thing outside to lean closer. Then I heard it again. My name. This time not stretched over the water, not muffled by distance. It was right at the glass, just behind my ear, like someone had leaned down and whispered it through the crack in the door seal. I snapped my head to the side window, my whole body recoiling. Nothing. Just condensation fogging the glass where my own shallow breaths filled the air. I couldn't stay. I shoved the van into drive and slammed my foot down. The tires crunched gravel and spatted in an arc as I lurched onto the road, headlights swinging wildly through the pines. Branches clawed the windshield, and I didn't care. I just kept going, engine groaning, until the trees thinned and the two-lane highway opened in front of me. But the horn followed. I swear it did. Long, low, rolling in waves behind me. It wasn't constant. It came in intervals, as if the ferry was pacing me, keeping its distance but never letting me out of its reach. Each time it bellowed, the sound rattled something loose inside me, like it wasn't meant for ears, but for marrow. Mile markers blurred past. My eyes stung from darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see glowing stacks bearing down on me from the dark shoulder of the road. But all that chased me was fog. Thick, curling, unnatural fog that clung to the treetops and bled onto the asphalt like spilled smoke. It wasn't until I saw the green reflective sign, wayside parking, half mile, that I realized I was going to break. I couldn't drive all night in this state. My arms trembled, teeth chattered, not from cold, but from a bone-deep dread that coiled tighter with each mile. I needed to stop to collect myself. When the turnout appeared, I swung the wheel hard. The van fishtailed slightly before correcting, headlights flooding an empty paved lot bordered by scraggly birches. A picnic table sat crooked under a lamp that hadn't worked in years. I killed the engine, and immediately the silence pressed in. The horn didn't follow. Not then. For a moment, I let myself believe I'd outrun it. My chest heaved with uneven breaths, my hands still gripping the wheel like letting go meant surrender. I could hear the lake faintly again, muffled through the trees on the far side of the lot, just waves, just water. Then the smell hit. It rolled in through the vents, though the van was off. Impossible, but there it was. That metallic tang of rust, thick and wet. Stronger now, like chains dragged from the bottom of the lake, dripping in decay. I gagged and covered my mouth, fumbling to crank a window closed even though it was already sealed. The smell didn't care, it wanted in. And then came the sound of footsteps, not gravel this time, not shoreline, wet, slapping, dragging, like boots filled with water stomping across the lot. I squeezed my eyes shut, clenching every muscle, begging them to pass. But they didn't. They circled. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of water pooling beneath each step, seeping, then sucking away when lifted again. I couldn't stand it anymore. I cracked one eye and shifted the mirror down. A figure stood under the broken lamp. Not a fisherman. Not a camper. Too tall, too rigid, its clothes hanging in tatters like fabric eaten by salt. Its face, God, its face was washed pale. No features but the suggestion of eyes, hollow and glistening like stones at the bottom of a tide pool. It stared directly at the van, head cocked, water spilling constantly from its sleeves, dripping onto the pavement until a slick puddle spread around its boots. The horn blew again, and this time the figure moved. It didn't walk. It leaned forward and slid as though carried on a current invisible to me, water streaming in rivulets behind it. My chest seized. I jammed the keys into the ignition, hands slipping on sweat, and turned. The engine coughed, caught. Headlights cut across the lot, and in that beam, the figure was gone. The only thing left was a trail. Wet footprints, spiraling outward, leading back into the fog toward the lake. I drove until my eyes burned and the gas gauge hovered dangerously low. Drove until the sky bled gray with dawn and the fog thinned. Somewhere near Marquette, I pulled into a truck stop and parked between two 18-wheelers, the most human company I could find. My hands didn't stop shaking for hours. But here's the thing. Sleep never came. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard it. That horn. Not distant anymore, not behind me. It rang inside my chest, each blast a command I couldn't disobey. Come back, step closer, walk into the water. I thought it would fade. I thought sunrise would burn it away. But even now, even as I sit here trying to convince myself it was exhaustion, stress, anything but what it seemed, I hear it. I hear the ferry calling. And the next time, I don't know if I'll be able to resist. The days that followed should have dulled the memory, but instead they sharpened it, whittling every nerve inside me into a point. I thought distance would break the spell. Just drive, keep the van moving west, let the map roll out until the shoreline of Superior was nothing but a smear behind me. But no matter where I went, the lake seemed to follow. I could be 200 miles inland, parked in a rest stop cornfield, and I'd hear it. The low horn rising out of the dark, not booming, not thunderous, but steady, mournful, vibrating through my ribs as if my body were a tuning fork tuned only to that sound. At first, I tried to drown it out. Music blasting through the van speakers, podcasts, anything to mask the noise. But the horn wasn't outside anymore. It was in me, buried in marrow, crawling up my spine at night until I woke drenched in sweat with the taste of rust thick on my tongue. Sleep grew thin, then vanished. In its place came visions. Always water, always dark. I'd see the ferry pulling closer through fog glowing faintly and figures lined along its railing, faces smudged, dripping, waiting, and always, always the call of my name. The way it stretched the syllables, pulling them apart like rope, fraying under strain, as if the lake itself were speaking. By the third night, I cracked. I couldn't pretend anymore. I knew what it wanted. The ferry wasn't bound to the water alone. It had me tethered. Wherever I went, its shadow followed. And denial. That thin, brittle shield finally broke when I pulled into a campground outside Duluth, desperate for sleep, and found the site already claimed. Not by another camper, by footprints. Fresh, wet, pressed deep into the soil as though someone had just stepped out of Superior's waves and walked straight inland. They circled the fire pit once, then stopped in front of the very pad where I had parked my van. The ground was dry everywhere else, pine needles brittle and curled, but there those prints remained, puddled, glistening under the pale light of the moon. My first instinct was to flee, but something in me, some awful tug I couldn't shake, made me follow them. I left the van running, flashlight in hand, boots crunching through needles as I trailed those wet marks. They led into the trees, weaving between trunks until the sound of the lake pressed close again. That's when I smelled it. The iron stench hit me so hard I gagged, the same metallic tang of rust mixed with brine like the breath of something that had drowned a century ago and never stopped rotting. My stomach lurched, but I pressed on because the prints didn't stop. They grew fresher, wetter, until droplets spattered the pine needles themselves. And then the trees broke, and I stood at the shoreline. The ferry waited offshore. Not a mirage, not imagination. Its glow burned pale against the mist, stacks tall and black, railing lined with shadows that didn't move. My flashlight beam wavered across the water, but it didn't matter. The ferry was brighter than anything I held. Its horn sounded once more, and the earth seemed to lean toward it. I stumbled, knees weak, because I realized the footprints didn't stop at the edge of the lake. They walked in. One step, two, into the black water, still pressing deep as if the surface was solid. The trail reached toward that ghostly ferry like an invitation. My name whispered again, carried across the waves. I backed away, tripping over driftwood, heart-hammering. The beam of my flashlight darted back and caught something half buried in sand. I bent down without thinking, fingers brushing against cold metal. When I pulled it free, my skin crawled. It was a ticket. Sodden, the ink smeared but legible enough. One passage. SS Wraith. Non-returnable. The paper was soft, nearly pulp, yet when I held it, the horn sounded louder, closer, and every figure on the ferry deck leaned forward as if they knew. I dropped it and ran. Branches lashed my arms, pine needles clawed at my legs, but I didn't stop until the van's headlights cut through the trees. I tore inside, slammed the door, floored the gas, and didn't look back until the town's sodium lights blurred against my windshield. But even then, as the road stretched and the lake disappeared behind me, I knew. The ticket hadn't stayed on that shore. My pocket was wet. I reached in with trembling fingers, and there it was, sodden, dripping, ink bleeding across my palm. No matter where I ran, no matter how far inland I went, the ferry had already claimed me. And the worst part? Some part of me wanted to board. I kept driving west as if asphalt alone could keep me safe, but every mile I put between myself and Superior only twisted the knot inside me tighter. The ticket in my pocket never dried. I tried everything. Left it on the dashboard in the sun, pressed it between the pages of a guidebook, even tossed it into a trash can outside a gas station. But when I slid my hand back into my pocket later, there it was, wet, bleeding ink, heavy with a weight it shouldn't have carried. Sleep became impossible, not because of the road noise, not because of the strangers in passing campgrounds, but because I'd close my eyes and find myself back at that shoreline, always standing in the same place, always watching the ferry pull closer. I'd wake up gasping, my body convinced I'd been treading water, lungs burning, skin freezing. I could smell the rust of the deck plating, the oil-soaked ropes, the moldy breath of its cabins. And every time I woke, my clothes clung damp with sweat and something thicker, something that smelled faintly of lake water. One night, near a Forest Service campground far from any water, I set up just before dusk. The pines here were tall and ragged, branches knitted so thick overhead they smothered the sky. I thought, here I'll finally be too far. Even ghosts have boundaries, but boundaries mean nothing to things older than maps. I woke in the dark to the sound of creaking timbers. Not the pop of cooling branches, not the settling of the van frame. Timbers. Wood shifting under weight. The kind of sound ships make when waves shove their bellies side to side. My heart tripped over itself as I sat up, pressing my hand against the wall of the van. It trembled, gently, rhythmically, like I was afloat. The air was thick with damp. My breath fogged, the smell of salt choking me though I was hundreds of miles from the shore. And then, horn. It didn't echo through trees, it bellowed inside the campground. I ripped the curtain back, half expecting to see dark forest. Instead, pale light slashed between the trunks. My van wasn't parked in dirt anymore. The headlights, still off, caught the gleam of black water lapping against tires. The trees floated around me like rotted pylons, and beyond them, at impossible proximity, was the ferry, closer than ever. Its deck stretched long, rails dripping, and this time the figures weren't waiting still. They moved, slowly, pacing, hands dragging along the rails, faces turning in unison toward me, hollow eyes, mouths open as if to breathe words they hadn't spoken in years. The horn groaned again, and the van tilted. Not much, but enough that the coffee mug I'd left on the counter slid and clattered to the floor. I scrambled for the keys, but they weren't in the ignition. My chest seized. I pawed at the dash, the seat, the floorboards, but nothing. That sodden ticket was the only thing my hand found, stuck fast against my thigh like it had fused there. Then came the knock. 3 dull thuds against the sliding door, as if a heavy fist had struck metal. My throat locked. I couldn't move. The second knock rattled harder, denting the panel inward. Water seeped through the rubber seal, a black line crawling across the floor. And then a voice, not shouting, not angry, just calm as if repeating a fact. It's time. I screamed, tore at the latch, and flung the opposite door open. Cold mist rolled in, and with it the stench of decay so strong my eyes watered. The forest was gone, only fog, only shifting planks beneath me, slick with algae. I wasn't on land anymore. My van sat on the deck of the ferry, impossibly balanced, its wheels locked in rusted grooves like it had been there for years. Figures circled. Water dripped from their sleeves, pooling around boots that never seemed to empty. They whispered. Not just my name now, but numbers, places, fragments of other names I didn't know. Every sound braided together until it became a single chant, low and endless like the hum of the engine below us. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut. The van rocked under my weight, but I didn't care. I dove for the glove box, clawing until my fingers hit the spare key. By the time it jammed into the ignition, the windshield was no longer fogged. It was black. Water pressed against the glass, rippling with the weight of something vast moving just beyond. I turned the key. The engine roared, headlights blazing, and the ferry dissolved. One moment, my van teetered on slick planks. The next, it sat crooked in the very same campsite where I'd parked, pine needles scattered across the hood, tires sunk slightly into dirt. No water, no figures, no glow. But the horn still rang, inside me. Louder now. Relentless. And when I looked down at my dashboard, water dripped steadily from the vents, pooling across my lap. The ticket lay plastered to the steering wheel, its ink clearer than ever. Ducking. Midnight. I kept telling myself I wouldn't check the clock, but my eyes betrayed me. Every few breaths, I glanced at the glowing green digits on the dash, willing them to crawl slower, to pause, to give me space. But they didn't. Each minute fell away like a nail driven into wood, and the word stamped on the ticket, midnight, loomed heavier with every second that bled out of me. The campground was still. Too still. No wind rattling pine needles, no insects droning in the grass, and no distant snap of branches from wandering deer. It felt as if everything had emptied out, as if even the forest refused to watch what was about to happen. My headlights cut across the trees, and the beams seemed strangled by fog that hadn't been there moments before. My lungs strained against air that was wet, thick, each breath tasting faintly of iron. I tried to run. I told myself the van could still carry me, that rubber tires could outpace whatever ancient claim the ferry thought it had. I twisted the key, felt the engine rumble beneath me, and slammed my foot to the floor. The van lurched, dirt spitting from its tires, but then it jerked, stopped, like a chain had cinched tight around the axles. The engine growled, but the wheels spun against nothing. The horn blew, so close it shook the fillings in my teeth. I slammed the gear into reverse, back into drive, anything, but it didn't matter. The van wasn't mine anymore. My hands flew to the door handle, yanking, throwing it open, spilling me into the night. My boots struck dirt, but even as they did, I heard the shift beneath me, the groan of timbers, the slap of waves. I wasn't in the woods anymore. The ground had become planks, slick and swollen with water. Mist swirled waist-high, carrying the reek of mildew and engine grease. The van sat behind me, and the wheels locked in grooves like freight on a loading dock. And stretching out in front of me, endless and pale, was the ferry's deck. Figures lined the railings. Dozens, maybe more. Their shapes shifted with the fog, but every face was hollowed, washed clean of life, dripping lake water. Some wore tattered coats, others uniforms that looked like sailors from a century past, their caps askew, their mouths opening and closing in slow rhythm like they'd forgotten how words were supposed to sound. And yet they whispered my name, over and over. My pulse hammered so hard I thought my chest would split. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the van, breath short, knees buckling. "No," I croaked, voice cracking. I'm not getting on." The horn blew again. The deck lurched forward, carrying me with it, and I realized the ferry was moving, not docking, not leaving, just drifting as though pulled by a current no eye could see. Out of the fog, water rose black on all sides, swallowing what remained of forest and shore. Lake Superior stretched endlessly around us, silent but for the hiss of waves lapping against the hull. And then the figures stepped down, not walking, sliding, feet never lifting, just dragging through puddles that pooled on the planks. Their arms dangled, fingers dripping, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that wasn't physical. It was older, deeper, like they needed me to complete something left unfinished. The first reached the van, pressing its palm flat against the glass. The window fogged instantly, droplets streaking downward though it hadn't rained. I scrambled to the other side, yanking the passenger door handle. It opened, spilling me onto the deck. I ran. Every step splashed water. The planks were warped, slick, tilting beneath me as if the ferry wanted to throw me down. The fog thickened, but through it, I saw the outline of a stairwell descending into darkness. For a breath, instinct screamed at me not to go down, but behind me the whispering swelled into a chorus, voices layering atop each other until they became one long groan that sounded almost like the horn itself. I bolted down the stairs. The air grew colder, the smell stronger. Rust, salt, rot. My hand brushed the rail, and flakes of corroded metal came away, cutting my palm. The steps ended at a corridor barely lit by a single swinging bulb, its light jaundiced and weak. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, pooling around my boots. Doors lined the corridor, rusted, swollen, some hanging crooked on their hinges. One creaked open as I passed, and I couldn't help but look. Inside was a cabin, bunk beds, blankets soaked, sagging. But it wasn't empty. A man sat on the lower bunk, his head bowed, his clothes a sailor's uniform stained black. His chest rose and fell slow, but when his head lifted, his eyes were nothing but holes leaking lake water. His mouth opened, and out came a voice that wasn't his, that was too deep, too wide. "You're already aboard." I stumbled back, nearly falling into the flooded corridor. My breath tore from me, panic full and unrelenting. I turned and ran, boots pounding, but no matter how many doors I passed, the corridor stretched on. Longer, endless, each bulb swinging in unison, shadows bending toward me like they knew. The horn blew again, this time so loud the bulb shattered, plunging me into darkness. And in that dark, hands rose from the water, cold, wrinkled, gripping my ankles, my wrists, my clothes, pulling me down. I thrashed, kicked, screamed, but the water wasn't shallow anymore. It had risen past my knees, my waist, climbing with impossible speed until it filled my mouth. Rust flooded my tongue, iron heavy, suffocating. As the last of my breath left me, the chorus of voices grew clear, dozens layered into one command. Stay. And then the water closed over my head. When the water closed over my head, I thought that was it. Thought the lake had finally claimed me the way it had claimed so many nameless others, swallowed into the black and filed away in some endless ledger written in rust. My chest burned, vision fractured, and I waited for that final unraveling. But instead, I woke. Not on the ferry, not in the corridor, not drowning. I woke in my van. The driver's seat was reclined halfway, my jacket draped across me as if I'd dozed off there on purpose. Morning lights slanted through the windshield, painting the dashboard in thin gold. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, not because I was choking on water, but because the world felt too normal, too clean. The smell of pine replaced the reek of iron. Birds chirped, cautious but alive. I sat up slowly, palms shaking, brushing at my clothes. Dry, perfectly dry. My boots were clean, no silt, no rot. And yet, when I reached for the steering wheel, the ticket was still there, pressed flat, sodden, its ink darker than ever. Docking, midnight. Except the time had changed. Docking, tonight. I dropped it like it burned, heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed to run, to get back on the road, put 1,000 miles between me and this cursed lake. But a new dread settled heavier than panic, because the message wasn't about place. It was about time. It didn't matter where I went. The ferry would come. That realization nearly broke me. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to steady my breath. My face looked older somehow, gaunt, drained, eyes ringed dark, like the night itself had seeped into me. I whispered out loud as if saying it might convince myself it wasn't real, it was a dream. But then I looked at my wrist. Bruises bloomed where those hands had grabbed me. Long, finger-shaped marks ringed purple, fading into green. Proof I couldn't argue away. Proof the ferry hadn't just been a dream. The day crawled. I tried everything to resist the pull. Drove inland, filled the tank twice, stopped at diners where human voices clattered and plates crashed, and neon buzzed above linoleum floors. Each place felt like a lifeline, and yet each time the clock ticked closer to midnight, the air grew heavier. People's words dulled in my ears. My reflection in glass warped faintly, as if water rippled between me and the world. By evening, I gave up pretending. The horn had returned, faint but steady, threading through every sound, my fork clattering on the plate, the rumble of trucks on the interstate, even the hum of my own tires. Always that same mournful call. When the sun sank, I found myself steering north again. I didn't decide to. My hands did. My body did. Every road seemed to funnel toward Superior, as if the map itself had collapsed into one inevitable line. And by the time the last light drained from the sky, I was there. Shoreline. Stones slick with mist. Water rolling black under a thin moon. I parked without realizing I'd done it, the headlights cutting across the waves. I sat there, frozen, until the fog thickened and the glow bloomed offshore. The ferry, waiting. The horn sounded and I felt the bruises on my wrists ache, throb as if answering. I should have driven. I should have fought. But something in me broke that night. A strange resignation, the same kind that must have lived in the faces of all those figures on the deck. Some things you don't resist. Some doors once opened, you don't shut. I stepped out of the van. The air was colder than it should have been, the wind knifing straight through my jacket. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked to the edge. The water lapped soft, inviting, pulling rhythmically in time with the glow. And there, waiting for me at the shoreline, were the footprints. Fresh, wet, leading out into the waves. This time, I didn't run. I stepped into the water. It should have been freezing, but it wasn't. It was heavy, thick, like walking through breath instead of liquid. Each step drew me deeper, but I didn't sink. The water held me up, pressing gently against my legs, guiding me forward. The horn blew again, louder, fuller, vibrating through my bones, and the ferry loomed closer, its deck burning pale against the night. Figures crowded the railings, heads cocked, mouths open in silent welcome. I took another step, another, until the shoreline was gone behind me, until the glow swallowed everything. And then I stopped. Because through the mist on that wide steel deck, I saw something different. Not strangers, not nameless, hollow-eyed figures. I saw myself, Dozens of me, some gaunt, some bloated with water, some staring back with wide eyes that mirrored the same terror twisting in my gut. All versions, all trapped, each holding the same sodden ticket in a pale, dripping hand. The ferry wasn't offering me passage, it was demanding surrender, a surrender made by countless others before me. And in that instant, a sliver of resistance sparked. Because if all those other versions of me had boarded, maybe this time, this one, I could turn back. That spark of resistance was small, fragile, but it was enough. Enough to make me pause mid-stride with the water curling cold around my thighs. Enough to make me clench my fists even though the lake wanted them open, palms out, ready to accept the chains it was offering. The ferry loomed larger by the second, its pale glow spilling across the waves like a path I was meant to follow. The horn bellowed again, so deep and resonant that the air in my lungs seemed to vibrate in sympathy, and for a moment I almost gave in. I almost believed that to board was the only way to silence it. But then I looked again at the railings, at the endless copies of myself lined shoulder to shoulder, dripping, slack-jawed, hollow. I saw the hopelessness in their stares, the way they didn't resist anymore. Each of them had believed the same lie, that stepping forward was the only way out, and each of them had been wrong. They weren't passengers. They were cargo. They were proof. Something inside me snapped. No, I said, though my voice was hoarse and carried no weight against the wind. My legs trembled as I wrenched one foot backward, then the other. Every inch I pulled toward shore was like dragging stone. The water resisted, clinging, thickening, trying to glue me in place. My bruises throbbed like fire under my skin, burning hotter the farther I moved away. The chorus of whispers rose, urgent now, desperate. My name repeated by 1,000 tongues, overlapping, hissing through the fog. The figures along the rail leaned forward, hands stretching as if distance meant nothing, as if they could reach across the gulf of black water and drag me in any way. The horn thundered again, and for a heartbeat, the surface of the lake cracked like glass. I saw faces below me, countless faces suspended in the dark, eyes bulging, mouths frozen mid-scream, all pressed against the underside of the water as though it were a pane of ice holding them prisoner. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to let it take me, to sink into that collective silence. But something stronger than fear clawed at me. Anger. Rage at the thought of becoming just another figure on the deck, another hollow mouth whispering a name I no longer remembered. So, I ran. I turned, splashing, forcing my body through the water that had become molasses. Each step backward toward shore was war. My chest ached, my breath tearing, my ears ringing with that impossible horn. I didn't dare look back at the ferry because I knew if I saw it closing in, I'd lose what little will I had left. The shoreline appeared through the mist at last, pale gravel glinting faintly under a slice of moon. I lunged, stumbled onto wet stone, my knees crashing down hard enough to send shocks through my bones. But I was on land, solid, cold but solid. The whispers cut off in an instant. Silence fell so deep it made my ears ache. I lifted my head slowly, expecting the glow still to hover, the deck still to loom. But the water was empty, black, rolling gentle waves that lapped against stone like nothing had happened at all. No ferry, no figures, only the ticket. It lay on the gravel where I'd crawled ashore, soaked, heavy. My hands shook as I picked it up, the ink smeared but legible. One passage. SS Wraith. Docking. Missed. I didn't know whether to laugh or collapse. My chest heaved, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. I'd resisted. I'd said no. The lake hadn't expected that. But even as relief spread through me, another thought rooted itself deeper. It hadn't ended, because the bruises still throbbed, because the horn still echoed faintly in my bones, softer now but not gone, because the ticket, though marked missed, didn't disintegrate. It didn't vanish. It clung, damp and cold to my palm. And I realized the truth. The ferry doesn't stop. It circles. Night after night, it circles. You can refuse it once, maybe twice, but eventually it comes again. And when it does, you'll be weaker, tired, ready to believe its lie. I stumbled back to the van, half expecting it not to be there, but it was, sitting silent among the pines, headlights dim as if it hadn't moved. I climbed inside, locked the doors, though locks mean nothing against a lake, and sat gripping the wheel until dawn peeled over the horizon. I survived, but survival isn't escape, because as I write this, parked miles inland with no water in sight, I still hear it. Low, distant, patient, the ferry that never docked. And I know one night soon when the ticket reads docking, now I'll have to face it again. The only question is, how many refusals do you get before the water wins? I don't really talk about that summer anymore. Not with my family, not with the guys I used to work the towers with, and not even with the one person who might have believed me. My brother, who drowned when we were kids. He's the reason I became a lifeguard in the first place. But what happened on that stretch of the South Carolina coast during the thick heat of July isn't something you drop into conversation. It's the kind of thing that eats at you quietly, like salt in an open wound, until you're not sure if you've gone insane or if you just witnessed something nobody else was ever meant to see. The beach itself wasn't anything special, at least not compared to the postcard stretches farther north. It was long, flat, and open, framed by pale dunes that the wind reshaped every night. The sand had a grayish tint to it, something about the way the tides dragged up river silt from the marshes, and it never looked quite clean. But the tourists still came, families mostly, and a handful of locals who wanted to drink cheap beer on the shore while the kids splashed around in waist-high surf. My job was simple: scan the water, watch for riptides, keep an eye on kids too far from their parents. You get used to the rhythm. The sun cooking the towers by noon, the distant crash of waves against your hearing, the smell of coconut sunscreen and stale fries from the snack shack drifting up with every breeze. By the third week of July, I could close my eyes and almost time the day by the scent of the air. At dawn, it was brackish and cool, carrying the reek of tidal mud and cordgrass from the inlets. By mid-afternoon, the heat got so thick you could taste the metallic salt of your own sweat. And then in the evenings, when the crowd thinned and the tide began its retreat, the beach grew strangely silent, like the sound of the surf itself dulled, as if it were pulling back into some hollow place offshore. That's when I started noticing the names. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just kids writing in the sand, carving Ashley Loves Cody with sticks, or dragging their heels to make giant crooked hearts. But the names I saw weren't scrawled in a playful hand. They were etched deep into the sand, crisp as if carved by a blade. I noticed them one evening as I made my final walk down the Strand, checking for lost towels or beer cans. The tide had just gone out, leaving the sand smooth and glistening. And there it was, a single word written 20 feet from the waterline. Shane. The letters were long, perfectly straight, not like the messy loops you'd expect from a kid. They were as precise as if someone had taken a carpenter's square and cut them into the beach itself. The unsettling part was that the letters weren't just surface scratches. They were sunk into the sand by an inch or two, every groove darker and wetter than the ground around it. I glanced up and down the beach, expecting to see someone laughing, pointing out their handiwork. But the Strand was empty, the last of the families already gone, their cars pulling away from the lot behind the dunes. I crouched by the name, ran my fingers through the grooves, half expecting to find a stick or rock that someone had used. The sand was smooth, compacted, almost unnatural, like the pressure of the letters had fused it. I thought about erasing it, but something in me resisted. Instead, I just backed away, heart thumping harder than it should have, telling myself it was a prank. Someone with too much time on their hands. That night, I couldn't shake the image of it. I even dreamed about it. The dream was simple, me standing ankle deep in the tide, staring at a word being written into the sand by invisible hands, not quick strokes either. Each letter pressed itself down slowly, grain by grain, as though the beach was branding itself. The next morning, I asked around. I figured figured maybe Shane was one of the local kids, or maybe a camper from the RV park that bordered the dunes. Nobody seemed to know. A few of the younger guards shrugged, said it was probably nothing. My supervisor, a guy named Dean, who'd been running that stretch for 15 years, just gave me a flat look and told me to stay focused on the water. But the names kept coming. Every evening, right after the tide went out, a new one would appear. They never repeated, never appeared in the same place twice. Sometimes they were close to the dunes, sometimes nearly at the edge of the surf, always alone, always carved deep and perfect. Maria, Tyler, Jen, Cameron. It didn't take long before I recognized one of them. That week, a boy about 14 had gone missing down the coast. He'd been bodyboarding with his cousins when he vanished under the water. They never found him. His name was Tyler. And 2 evenings later, there it was on my beach, etched clean into the sand as if the tide itself had carried the name north and laid it at my feet. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every name I saw, along with the time and the tide. Within a week, I had 12 names. When I cross-checked them against old newspaper clippings and local bulletins at the library, 6 of them matched drownings from the past 15 years. That's when I stopped sleeping. You see, it wasn't just the names. It was the way the beach began to feel once I noticed them. During the day, everything looked normal. Umbrellas dotting the sand, kids screaming, sunscreen shining on shoulders. But in the evenings, when the tide rolled out and the last families packed up, the air changed. The gulls grew silent. The breeze turned colder, sharp with the scent of wet stone. And every step I took seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the sand beneath my feet wasn't entirely solid. I'd stand on the tower watching the horizon and feel eyes on me, not from the people on the beach, but from the sea itself. Like the line where the water met the sky was an open lid, hiding something that wanted to see me more than I wanted to see it. One night, after the beach had emptied, I stayed behind with a flashlight. I told myself I was being thorough, just scanning for lost items before the morning crowd. But what I was really doing was waiting for the tide to fall. Sure enough, the sand began to firm and glisten under the moonlight. The last foam retreated down the slope, and then, not 20 yards from me, a new name pressed itself into being. Letter by letter, I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the sand dimpled inward. First a long straight line, then a curve, then another. It wasn't fast. Each stroke took a good 15 seconds, as though invisible weight were pressing into the beach from beneath. By the time the final letter settled, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the light. Angela, the name of a woman who had drowned 2 summers earlier, swept off the jetty by a storm swell. I remembered the search, the way her fiancé screamed at the rescuers. I remembered Dean saying quietly, "She's gone, man. Don't fight the ocean." And here it was, written as if the tide itself was a ledger, recording debts that the sea had taken. I stumbled back, nearly fell, then forced myself to turn off the light and get the hell out of there. My truck was parked by the dunes, and I drove so fast I nearly lost control on the sandy track. I didn't stop shaking until I was home, staring at my notebook, realizing the truth. The beach wasn't just remembering the dead. It was naming them, one by one, and I had no idea why it wanted me to see. I tried to quit the job that week. Walked into Dean's shack on a Wednesday morning and told him I couldn't handle the hours anymore, that I needed a break. He didn't even look surprised. He just nodded, jotted something on his clipboard, and said, "Finish the month. We're short-handed." I almost pushed harder, but something about his tone stopped me, like he already knew what I was dealing with, like others had stood in that same doorway before, just as pale, just as hollow-eyed, so I stayed. I kept climbing the towers, kept blowing the whistle at kids drifting too far out, kept making my end-of-day walks. But I also kept the notebook, though I stopped writing the names in the open. Instead, I'd jot them in quick shorthand, folding the paper into my back pocket so nobody else could see. Because by then I'd started to feel it. The names weren't just a message. They were a pattern, and the more I looked, the more the pattern began to close in. It started with a girl named Hannah. Her name appeared late, almost at midnight, when I'd lingered too long by the dunes. The moon was sharp, the tide pulled thin, and there it was, etched clean across the sand in the same unnerving precision. Hannah. The next day, a mother showed up at the tower, frantic. She was visiting from inland Georgia with her husband and 2 daughters. The younger girl, Hannah, had gone missing during the night. She'd wandered from the camper parked at the nearby RV lot. They searched the dunes, the boardwalk, even the marsh. Nothing. I didn't say a word. I just watched as the search parties combed the strand, watched as the father shouted into the surf, his voice cracking in a way that went through my bones. By evening, they were gone, and I knew, long before anyone admitted it, that they would never find her, because the beach had already claimed her. From then on, I read every name differently, not as history but as warning. Sometimes they matched a drowning in the papers. Sometimes they matched a disappearance from the campground. And sometimes they didn't match anything at all, at least not yet. That's when the fear turned inward. You see, once you realize the sand is writing the future, you start to wait for the one name you can't bear to see. You start dreading the moment when the grooves spell out someone you love, or worse, your own. I started checking the beach more obsessively, pacing long after the crowd left, flashlight trembling in my hands. Each new name felt like a verdict. Justin, Maya, Christopher. I didn't know most of them, but every time I recognized even a hint of familiarity, someone's cousin, a coworker's nephew, it drove a stake deeper into me. I stopped eating right. My hands shook during shifts. Dean pulled me aside once and muttered, "You've seen them, haven't you?" But when I pressed him, he just walked away as if he'd said too much. That night, I couldn't resist. I waited for the tide again. I told myself I'd leave as soon as I saw the word form. But when the sand began to shift, I froze, letter by letter. Alex, my brother's name. My brother who drowned when we were 12. My brother whose memory had driven me into this job, who I sometimes still swore I could hear in the surf when the wind cut right. I dropped to my knees in the wet sand, clawing at the grooves like I could erase them, my fingernails filled with grit. My throat burned with salt, but the letters wouldn't smear. The sand just pressed back, firm and cold, until I felt like I was scratching at stone. When I finally stumbled away, I realized the truth that had been waiting for me all along. The beach wasn't just writing names. It was choosing them. Or maybe keeping them. I didn't know. All I knew was that it had marked my brother even years after his death. And now, maybe it was marking me. Because the next night, I saw something worse. I'd walked farther down the strand than usual, like nearly to the jagged jetty that cut the waterline in half. The moon was high, the tide at its lowest, and the air had that strange brassy stillness that made every breath taste metallic. I was about to turn back when I noticed movement on the sand ahead, not letters forming, something else. The surface pulsed, like the beach itself was breathing. Dark hollows appeared in the wet grit, then smoothed themselves away like something massive was pressing upward from below. I backed up fast, tripping over driftwood, my flashlight beam jerking wildly, and then with a slow, deliberate shiver, a new name pushed itself into the sand. Ethan. My name. The letters were longer than usual, gouged so deep that water immediately seeped into them, turning the grooves into dark channels. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The beach had written me, and for the first time I realized I wasn't just a witness. I was part of its ledger. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my name, feeling the cold creep up my legs like the tide was climbing faster than I could back away. Finally, I turned and ran. I didn't care about the tower, the job, or the paycheck. I ran for my truck, sand spraying behind me, lungs on fire. But here's the part that still twists my stomach every time I remember it. When I got home and yanked out my notebook, the last page had changed. The names I'd written weren't in my scrawl anymore. They were carved, pressed so deep into the paper that I could feel the grooves with my fingertips. And at the bottom, below every other name, There it was, Ethan. My hands shook so badly the pen rolled off the table. I should have left then. Packed up, driven inland, never looked back. But leaving felt impossible, like the tide itself had wrapped chains around me. Every night, I dreamed of the letters pressing themselves into my skin. Every morning, I woke with grit between my teeth, like I'd been swallowing sand in my sleep. The beach had me, and deep down, I knew it wasn't going to let go. I didn't go back to the tower the next morning. I sat in my truck outside the dunes, staring at the thin line of the horizon, and felt a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The others would notice soon enough, but I didn't care. By afternoon, though, something dragged me back onto the sand. Not duty, not fear of being fired. Something heavier, like the tide itself had a pull on me, invisible but constant. I walked barefoot, not even carrying my whistle or pack. The sun was brutal, heat bouncing off the flat beach, but beneath it was another sensation, an undertow of cold threading through the air like veins of ice. I followed it down the strand, past families and umbrellas, past the towers, until the crowds thinned and the beach stretched empty. The sand there looked untouched, smooth and slick with retreating foam. But I knew better. I could feel it. The quiet in the air, the way the gulls wheeled wide of this stretch, the taste of brine that coated my tongue even though I hadn't been near the water yet. The tide was leaving, and I knew what was coming. I sat down on the damp grit, my back against a piece of driftwood, and waited. Hours passed. Shadows lengthened. The sun dropped until the sky was nothing but steel gray and orange bleeding together. Then, as if on cue, the surface of the sand rippled. The name came slow, deliberate, each letter pressing downward, holding for a breath, then moving on. Not my name this time. Dean, the supervisor. The man who had been watching me more closely lately. The man who had said, "You've seen them, haven't you?" like he'd already carried the knowledge himself. I wanted to run, to warn him, to drag him out here and shove his face into the sand so he'd see. But when I stood, I realized my legs wouldn't move, not from fear, from something else, something that rooted me in place like the sand itself had wrapped up my ankles. That was when I saw it. Beyond the name, maybe 30 yards down the wet strand, the sand wasn't just flattening, it was sinking. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the ground had lost its density. Dark water welled up in patches, then retreated, then welled again like breath. And with each rise and fall, I swore I saw shapes pressing against the surface from below. Not bodies, not fish, something else. Something that moved with the patience of tide and stone. I stumbled backward until I could breathe again, then bolted for my truck. That night I couldn't sit still. My notebook was open in front of me, and every time I tried to read it, the names blurred. I tore out page after page, burned them in the sink, watched the paper curl and blacken, but the grooves still showed on the table beneath the notebook, carved into the wood. I didn't sleep. By morning, Dean was gone. The rumor spread fast. He'd gone out fishing, hadn't returned. His truck was still at the lot. No body, no sign of where he went. I didn't have to ask. I knew. The beach had called his name, and now he belonged to it. I couldn't take it anymore. That evening, I made a decision. Not to leave. It was too late for that. The beach already had my name, but I had to see. I had to know what lay beneath. So I packed a single bag. Flashlight, water, rope, no whistle, no radio. And after the crowds cleared out, I walked straight to the place where the sand had sunk the night before. The tide was pulling out, the waves dragging low against the shore. The air had that brassy tang again, like the inside of a coin pressed against your tongue. I stood there, watching the sand shiver and breathe. Then, slowly, I stepped forward. At first, it was like walking on wet cement. Firm, but with just enough give that I could feel weight shifting beneath. Then, as I reached the center, the ground gave way. My leg sank to the knee, then the thigh, cold water surging up around me. I should have panicked, should have fought my way out, but something about the pull was gentle, not drowning me, not dragging me, just holding, drawing me closer, inch by inch, as though guiding me into some hollow space beneath the beach. I switched on my flashlight and aimed it down. For a moment, the beam showed nothing but black water and silt. Then, shapes began to coalesce. Faces. Dozens of them. Eyes wide, mouths open, staring up through the shifting veil. Not corpses, at least not in the way we think of them. They weren't bloated or broken. They looked preserved, like the sea itself had sealed them in glass. And they were moving, their lips parted, their hands reached, not in struggle, but in rhythm, as if they were spelling something in the dark. The sand above me shifted. Letters pressed themselves around my body. I realized with a cold stab that they weren't writing for me. They were writing with me. My weight, my presence was being used to carve the ledger into the surface. I screamed. The sound came out muffled, swallowed by the air, as though the beach itself didn't want me heard. I thrashed, tore my legs free, stumbled backward through the surf until I collapsed on the dry sand, gasping like a man who'd just broken surface after nearly drowning. The faces were gone. The sinkhole was gone. The beach looked flat and empty, smooth under the fading moonlight. But in front of me, carved clear across the sand, was a single phrase. Stay. I left that night. I packed the truck, drove inland until the salt smell vanished, until the sound of waves was nothing but memory. But here's the part I can't escape. The names didn't stop. Not for me. Everywhere I go, hotels, apartments, friends' couches, I wake to find grains of sand in my sheets. Sometimes on the bathroom mirror, there's a smear I didn't leave. Wipe it away and the condensation reforms a word. A name. Someone I read about in the news the next week. Sometimes someone I knew. And twice now, it's been mine. Not just Ethan. Whole sentences. Ethan. Return. I don't sleep much anymore. I don't walk barefoot. And I don't go near the coast, though sometimes when the wind shifts, I swear I can still taste that brassy tang in the air. The beach keeps its ledger, and I know one day it will collect.